Hey everyone, welcome to Camping Horror Stories. Every year campers disappear in RV camping Appalachian Mountain's deadly mistake. Some are found, but most are not. Those who return whisper of strange figures in the trees, distant voices calling, their names, and an overwhelming feeling that something is hunting them. Tonight we dive into the terrifying encounters of campers who heard these voices and lived to regret it. Are you brave enough to listen? Subscribe and turn on notifications if you dare. We left Mirror Lake that day, packing up our campsite in a daze of grief and shock. The Winnebago felt empty, silent, the usual boisterous energy of our family camping, trips replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. Buster whimpered softly in the back, sensing our sorrow.
Story for Hey, I'm Sarah. RV camping with my family is our annual tradition. Every summer, as soon as school let out and the cicadas started their relentless buzzing, we'd pack up our lives into our trusty, if slightly battered, Winnebago and hit the road. It was Mom, Dad, my little brother Timmy, Buster the Beagle, and me, Sarah, your average, slightly cynical 16-year-old narrator. While my friends were dreaming of beach vacations and summer jobs, I was mentally preparing myself for weeks of questionable campground bathrooms, campfire sing-alongs that stretched on way too long, and Dad's infamous nature walks that always seemed to involve him pointing out different types of moss for hours. Don't get me wrong, I loved my family, and deep down, I even appreciated the tradition. It was just, well, sometimes serene nature felt a lot more like bug-infested boredom. This year, Mom had declared, was going to be different. No more crowded tourist traps. She'd announced at the dinner table one evening, brandishing a glossy brochure. This year, we're going off the beaten path. We're going to Mirror Lake in the Appalachians, Mirror Lake. The name itself sounded promising, almost magical. The brochure depicted a pristine lake reflecting a backdrop of majestic, tree-covered mountains under a sky so blue it looked airbrushed. Serene. The brochure proclaimed an elegant script, untouched. A hidden gem of the Appalachian wilderness. Dad, ever the pragmatist, had immediately started researching campgrounds and routes, muttering about gas mileage and hookup availability. Timmy, bless his 8-year-old heart, was just excited about the prospect of exploring the woods and catching a fish as big as Buster. Even Buster, our beagle mix, seemed to perk up at the mention of woods, his nose twitching in anticipation of new and exciting smells. Me. I remained cautiously optimistic. Appalachia sounded remote, maybe even genuinely serene. And, if I was being honest, the idea of escaping the relentless summer heat and humidity of our suburban life for the cooler mountain air was definitely appealing. Plus, maybe, just maybe, there would be decent enough cell service for me to at least occasionally check in with the real world and reassure my friends I hadn't been completely swallowed by the wilderness.so. A week later, there we were, chugging along a winding mountain road, the Winnebago groaning under the strain of the incline. The landscape was undeniably beautiful. Towering trees formed a dense canopy overhead, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the asphalt. Jagged rock formations jutted out from the hillsides, draped in moss and ferns. The air was noticeably cooler and cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Even I had to admit, Mom had chosen well. This was definitely a step up from last year's overcrowded RV park next to a highway. We finally reached the turnoff for Mirror Lake Campground, a narrow gravel road that snaked deeper into the woods. The brochure hadn't lied. It really did feel like we were venturing into a hidden world. The trees grew thicker, casting long shadows across the road even in the late afternoon sun. The sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The campground itself was small, rustic, and blessedly uncrowded. Just a handful of campsites were nestled amongst the trees, each with a fire pit and a picnic table. We found a spot near the lake's edge, backing the RV in carefully, Dad grumbling about the uneven ground. As soon as we parked and Dad cut the engine, an almost unnatural silence descended. It wasn't just the absence of traffic noise. It was a deeper quiet, a stillness that seemed to absorb all sound. Even Buster, usually a champion barker, was subdued, sniffing cautiously around the unfamiliar surroundings. And then I saw it. The mist.it was rising from the lake, not in wispy tendrils like morning fog, but in a thick, shimmering mass that clung low to the water's surface. It wasn't white or gray like any fog I'd ever seen. This was silver, almost metallic, and it pulsed with an inner light, like liquid moonlight trapped just above the water. It shimmered and flowed in patterns that seemed to defy natural air currents, swirling and shifting like mercury. My breath caught in my throat. "What is that?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Timmy, who had already scrambled out of the RV and was bouncing with pent-up energy, stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with fascination. "Whoa," he breathed, pointing towards the lake. "Look, Sarah, it's like magic smoke." Mom and Dad, emerging from the RV, paused, their usual campground bustle momentarily forgotten. Even they seemed taken aback by the sight of the strange mist.
Well, that's unusual, Dad said slowly, scratching his chin. I didn't see anything about mist in the brochure. Maybe it's just some kind of morning fog that's lingering late, Mom suggested, though even her voice lacked conviction. It was late afternoon, not morning, and this was definitely not ordinary fog. I shook my head, my unease growing. It's not fog, Mom. Look at it. It's silver, and it's shimmering. We stood there for a moment, the four of us staring at the lake and the strange unnatural mist that was slowly spreading across its surface. The air, already heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, seemed to thicken further, carrying a subtle, almost metallic tang that tickled my nostrils. Mirror Lake, the brochure had promised serenity. But the moment we arrived, the serenity had been replaced by something else, something strange. And as I watched the silver mist swirling and shimmering on the lake's surface, a cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. This was supposed to be a relaxing family vacation, but something told me deep down that this trip to Mirror Lake was going to be anything but serene. And that silver mist, it felt less like magic smoke and more like a warning. The next morning, the silver mist was still there. If anything, it seemed to have thickened overnight, now blanketing a larger portion of the lake. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the metallic haze, casting the entire campsite in a strange, muted light. The air felt heavier, damper, and the subtle metallic scent from the previous evening was stronger, almost acrid. Timmy, predictably, was drawn to it like a moth to a flickering flame. Before breakfast was even on the table, he was down by the lake's edge, kneeling in the damp grass, peering intently into the swirling silver. "He's still waving, Sarah," he announced excitedly, as I emerged from the RV, rubbing sleep from my eyes. "Come see, he's doing it right now." I sighed, already feeling a headache brewing. "Timmy, it's just a reflection. Reflections don't wave." But he was insistent, tugging at my pajama sleeve. "No, but this one does. He's special." Reluctantly, I followed him to the water's edge. The mist was even more unsettling up close. It wasn't just shimmering. It seemed to writhe and pulse with an unnatural energy. Looking into it was like staring into a pool of liquid metal, constantly shifting and reforming. And there, distorted and wavering in the silver depths, was Timmy's reflection. He was right about one thing. It did seem different. As Timmy moved, the reflection mimicked him, but with a strange, exaggerated delay, like it was struggling to keep up. And when Timmy waved, I could have sworn, yes, the reflection's hand seemed to linger in the air for a fraction of a second longer, almost as if it had a will of its own. See? Timmy crowed, his face beaming with childish delight. He waved, I told you. I frowned, a shiver tracing its way down my spine despite the morning sun, or what little of it managed to penetrate the mist. It's just the mist, Timmy. It's making it look weird. I wanted to believe that desperately. I wanted to dismiss it as some trick of the light, some natural phenomenon I didn't understand. But deep down, a cold, insistent voice whispered that it was more than that. No, it's him, Timmy insisted, oblivious to my growing unease. He's my friend now, he told me. He told you, I repeated, my voice laced with skepticism. Your reflection talked to you? Timmy nodded seriously, his bright blue eyes wide and earnest. Uh-huh. He whispers, really quiet so only I can hear. He says lots of things. My headache intensified. This was getting weird, even for Timmy. He had an active imagination, sure, but this felt different, more intense. What kind of things? I asked, trying to keep my voice light, casual. He shrugged, looking back at his reflection with a dreamy smile. Secrets. About the lake. About the woods. About other places. His voice trailed off, lost in his own little world of silver, mist and whispering reflections. I tried to steer him away from the lake, suggesting breakfast, cartoons in the RV, anything to distract him. But Timmy was fixated. He ate his pancakes listlessly, his gaze constantly drifting back towards the misty lake. Even Buster, usually Timmy's shadow, seemed reluctant to approach the water's edge, keeping a wary distance, his ears flattened, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He's really stuck on that mist, isn't he? Dad commented, watching Timmy through the RV window as he poked at his breakfast. Kids and their imaginations, eh? He chuckled, oblivious to the knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Dad, it's not just imagination, I said, trying to inject some urgency into my voice. It's creepy. Did you see that mist? It's not normal. And Timmy's saying his reflection is talking to him. Mom, ever the peacemaker, patted my hand, reassuringly. Oh, honey, don't worry so much. He's just being a kid. He's probably just making up stories. It's good for his imagination, right? But the mist, I persisted, gesturing towards the lake. It's really weird, Mom. And Timmy's acting different. He's usually bouncing off the walls by now. He's just quiet and staring. Dad waved a dismissive hand. He's probably just tired from the drive yesterday. He'll be fine. Let him enjoy the lake. That's why we came here, remember? To relax and enjoy nature. Relax and enjoy nature. Right. Except nature, at least around Mirror Lake, felt anything but relaxing. It felt watchful. The silence was too profound, the mist too unnatural, Timmy's fascination too intense. Everything felt subtly, disturbingly wrong. Throughout the day, Timmy remained tethered to the lake. He played near the mist, talked to his reflection, occasionally venturing closer to the water's edge despite my increasingly frantic warnings. Our parents, true to form, remained oblivious, chalking it up to boys being boys and the magic of nature. They were busy setting up camp, unpacking gear, and generally enjoying their serene getaway. They were completely missing the growing sense of unease that was settling over me. The prickling feeling on my skin whenever I looked at the mist. The way Buster whined and refused to go near the lake. The unsettling stillness in Timmy's usually bright eyes. I tried to distract Timmy, suggesting games, hikes, even offering him my tablet, a last resort, usually reserved for emergencies. But nothing worked. His attention was completely consumed by the misty lake and his friend within it. He'd agree to play for a few minutes, then his gaze would drift back to the water, and he'd be off again, drawn back to the silver shimmer like a compass, needle to north. By afternoon, the mist had spread further, now reaching almost to the edge of our campsite. It was thicker, denser, and the metallic shimmer seemed to have intensified, almost glowing in the dim, filtered sunlight. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the metallic tang was now undeniably unpleasant, like licking a rusty coin. I noticed other changes too. The trees around the lake, which had seemed so vibrant green the day before, now appeared duller, their leaves tinged with a strange grayish cast as if leached of their color by the encroaching mist. The birds, which had been chirping merrily that morning, had fallen silent. Even the usual campground sounds, distant laughter, the clatter of dishes, the crackling of campfires, seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. We were becoming isolated, cut off from the normal sounds and sights of the world, enveloped by the unnatural silence and the pervasive silver mist. And at the heart of it all was Timmy, kneeling by the lake, lost in his silent conversations with his reflection, his eyes reflecting the unnatural shimmer of the mercury-like haze. As evening approached, casting long, distorted shadows from the trees, the mist began to move differently. It wasn't just swirling and shifting anymore, it seemed to be reaching. Tendrils of silver haze stretched out from the lake's surface, snaking across the ground, probing towards the campsite like curious metallic fingers. They brushed against the picnic table legs, coiled around the base of trees, and even seemed to lick at the edges of our RV. And Timmy was getting closer. He was no longer just kneeling at the edge of the lake. He was wading in, ankle deep, then calf deep, his jeans soaking up the icy water, his eyes fixed on his reflection, which now seemed to stretch and distort even further in the thickening mist, becoming elongated and almost separate from him. "Timmy, get out of the water," I yelled, my voice cracking with a fear I could no longer ignore. "Timmy, come back here right now." He didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. He just kept wading deeper, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide and unfocused, a strange vacant smile playing on his lips. The silver mist swirled around his legs, obscuring his reflection, then reforming, solidifying, becoming something else. Something was terribly wrong. Horribly, terrifyingly wrong. And as I watched my little brother walk deeper and deeper into the mercury mist of Mirror Lake, a scream building in my throat, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that our family camping trip had just taken a turn into a nightmare from which we might never wake up. And the worst part was I had a sickening feeling that this nightmare was only just beginning. "Timmy!" I screamed again, my voice raw with panic. This time, Dad finally looked up from wrestling with the campfire grill. He followed my gaze to the lake, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. Timmy, waist deep in the silver mist, his back to us, seemingly oblivious to our calls, and the mist itself, writhing and reaching, no longer just a strange phenomenon, but something actively utter predatory. "Timmy, get back here," Dad bellowed, his voice losing its usual jovial tone and taking on an edge of alarm. He started towards the lake at a run, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Mom, who had been inside the RV, emerged, her face a mask of confusion which quickly morphed into horror as she grasped the situation. "What's happening? What's he doing?" she stammered, her hand flying to her mouth. "I don't know," I cried, my heart hammering against my ribs. "He's been like this all day, obsessed with that mist, and now he's walking into it." Dad was splashing through the shallows now, the silver mist swirling around his legs like disturbed smoke. Timmy, can you hear me? Come back now, it's not safe." But Timmy remained unresponsive, his small figure still moving further into the lake, drawn by some unseen force. As Dad got closer, I could see Timmy more clearly. His head was tilted, slightly, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. His vacant smile was still there, unsettling and unnatural, and then I saw it again, the horrifying distortion of his reflection in the mist. It wasn't just elongated and wavering anymore. It was solidifying. The silvery outline of his reflection seemed to detach itself from the shimmering surface, becoming more defined, more real. It was reaching out, yes, reaching out with long, slender, silvery hands that mirrored Timmy's own, but were somehow wrong. Too long, too thin, too inhuman. And then, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, I understood. It wasn't Timmy who was obsessed with the reflection. It was the reflection that was obsessed with him. It was calling to him, luring him in, whispering promises only he could hear. And Timmy, in his innocent, childlike fascination, was walking willingly into its trap. Dad reached Timmy just as the reflection's silvery hands closed around his brother's outstretched ones. There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath from Timmy, a strange, choked sound that wasn't quite a gasp and not quite a cry. And then, with terrifying speed, the reflection pulled. It wasn't a physical tug, not exactly. It was more like a dissolving. One moment Timmy was standing there, waist deep in the mist, his hand seemingly grasped by his silvery double. The next he was fading. His legs seemed to melt into the mist, then his torso, then his shoulders, until only his head and outstretched hand remained visible above the swirling silver surface. And then, with a final, silent ripple, he was gone, pulled down, swallowed whole by the mercury mist of Mirror Lake. Dad roared, a primal sound of anguish and fury. He lunged forward, plunging into the deeper water, disappearing beneath the surface of the mist in a spray of icy droplets. Mom and I stood frozen on the bank, our screams caught in our throats, our minds struggling to process the impossible horror we had just witnessed. One moment Timmy was there, entranced by his reflection. The next he was gone, vanished into thin air, or rather, into thin mist. Time seemed to stretch and distort, each second an eternity. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart and Mom's ragged, choked breaths beside me. The silver mist swirled and churned where Timmy had disappeared, as if the lake itself was digesting him, absorbing him back into its unnatural depths. Then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, Dad resurfaced. He burst from the mist, sputtering and gasping for air, his face contorted with effort and terror. And in his arms, limp and lifeless, he held Timmy. They stumbled out of the lake, collapsing onto the damp grass, Dad cradling Timmy's small body against his chest. Mom and I rushed forward, falling to our knees beside them, our relief warring with the chilling dread that still clung to the air. Timmy was soaking wet, shivering violently, his skin pale and clammy. He was coughing weakly, sputtering up lake water. But he was breathing. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me, so intense it almost made me faint. He was alive. He was back. Our nightmare was over. But even as that relief surged through me, I saw it. the wrongness. Something was different. Something was terribly, irrevocably altered. Timmy sat up slowly, his eyes fluttering open. They were wide, unnaturally wide, and unfocused, staring blankly ahead, seeing nothing, or perhaps seeing something we couldn't. He didn't cry, didn't whimper, didn't complain about the cold or the water or the terror of being pulled beneath the surface of a strange silver lake. He just sat there, motionless, his usual bright, mischievous spark completely extinguished. Mom reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his cheek. "Timmy. Honey, are you okay? Can you hear me?" He turned his head slowly, mechanically towards her, his movements stiff and unnatural. A faint, unsettling smile flickered across his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that was wrong. "I'm changed," he whispered, his voice raspy and thin, not quite Timmy's voice anymore. It was flatter, colder, devoid of the childish lilt I knew so well. "My friend, he showed me things. Beautiful things." He looked back at the lake, or rather, at the space where the lake had been, where the last wisps of silver mist were now dissolving into the encroaching darkness of twilight. And in his eyes, those wide, unfocused, strangely still eyes, I saw it. Not my brother, not entirely. Something else was there, something cold and reflective, something that had been kissed by the mercury mist of Mirror Lake and was forever altered. His skin was clammy, almost cold to the touch, even though the air was still relatively warm. His eyes were too still, too silver, reflecting the fading light of dusk and the last lingering traces of the mist, even though the mist itself was receding. They were like mirrors themselves, reflecting nothing but a cold, empty light. "Beautiful things," Mom repeated weakly, her voice trembling, her hand still hovering over his cheek, afraid to touch him, afraid of what she might find. What things, honey?" Timmy just smiled that unsettling smile again, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that held no warmth, no joy, no trace of the Timmy I knew. "Secrets," he whispered, his voice even raspier now, like dry leaves rustling in a cold wind. He showed me secrets of the lake, of the mist, of everything. He stood up then, slowly, deliberately, his movements still stiff and unnatural, and walked back towards the lake's edge. He stood there for a long moment, silhouetted against the darkening sky, staring out at the now mist-free water, his small figure radiating an unnatural stillness, an unsettling calm. And as I watched him, my heart sinking like a stone in my chest, I knew. Our family camping trip was far from serene. It had become a nightmare. And I feared with a bone-chilling certainty that went beyond mere sibling worry that this nightmare was just beginning. Timmy was back, yes. But the boy who had returned from the mercury mist of Mirror Lake, he wasn't really Timmy anymore. Something had come back with him. Something cold, something reflective, something other. And whatever it was now wearing my little brother's face. The first few hours after Timmy's return were a blur of frantic activity masking a deeper, more profound unease. Mom wrapped him in blankets, Dad started a roaring fire, and I made hot chocolate, my hands shaking so badly I nearly spilled it everywhere. We fussed over Timmy, asking him if he was cold, if he was hurt, if he remembered what happened. He answered in monosyllables, his voice still that unsettling rasp, his eyes still distant and silver-tinged. He drank the hot chocolate without comment, his movements mechanical, almost robotic. As the fire crackled and spat, casting flickering shadows that danced with the lingering twilight, we tried to piece together what had happened. Dad recounted his plunge into the lake, describing the water as shockingly cold even for late summer, and the mist as thick and disorienting, making it almost impossible to see. He hadn't seen Timmy being pulled under, hadn't seen anything at all in the swirling silver haze. He just felt around blindly in the murky depths until his hand brushed against something small and limp, and then he'd hauled him back to the surface. Mom kept asking Timmy questions, gentle, probing questions, trying to coax him to explain what he'd seen, what he'd experienced in the mist. "Honey, what was it like in there?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "Did you see anything? Did someone pull you?" Timmy just stared into the fire, his silver eyes reflecting, the flames without warmth. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "He showed me the other side." "The other side of what, sweetie?" Mom pressed, leaning closer, desperate for any explanation, any sign of the old Timmy. "The mirror," he whispered, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "He lives in the mirror, the misty mirror. He's lonely." A chill, deeper than the lake water, settled over the campsite. "Who is Timmy?" I asked, my voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Who lives in the mirror?" He finally turned his head, his silver eyes fixing on me, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a flicker of something familiar in their depths, a hint of the Timmy I knew. But it was quickly replaced by that unsettling stillness, that cold, reflective emptiness. "My friend," he said, the rasp in his voice deepening. "My friend in the mist." And that was all he would say. He retreated back into silence, staring into the fire, his small body rigid and unresponsive. We tried to get more out of him, but it was like talking to a statue. He was physically present, sitting beside the fire, drinking hot chocolate, breathing, but the Timmy we knew, the bright, curious, mischievous Timmy, was gone, replaced by something else. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped sharply, and a heavy fog, a natural fog this time, rolled in, blanketing the campsite and the surrounding woods. It was a normal fog, white and dissipating, but after the silver mist, it felt almost menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded amplified in the dense fog, making us jumpy and on edge. Buster, who had been unusually quiet all evening, started to whine and pace, his fur bristling, staring out into the fog-shrouded darkness as if he could see something we couldn't. We huddled together around the fire, the flickering flames our only defense against the encroaching darkness and the growing sense of dread. Timmy sat silently beside Mom, wrapped in blankets, his silver eyes reflecting the firelight, his gaze fixed on nothing, or perhaps everything. He was present, yet utterly detached, like a shell inhabited by something alien and cold. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every sound seemed to carry a hidden meaning. The normal night sounds of the forest, the hooting of owls, the chirping of crickets, were absent, replaced by an unnerving silence that pressed in on us from all sides. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Sometime in the pre-dawn hours, just as the first faint hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, I heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost inaudible, but undeniably there, carried on the damp night air. It seemed to come from the direction of the lake, a soft, sibilant murmur that sent shivers down my spine. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding, straining to hear over the crackling embers of the dying fire. There it was again, closer this time, clearer, A whisper, calling Timmy's name. Timmy. Timmy. I glanced at Timmy, who was still huddled, beside Mom, seemingly asleep. But as I watched, his eyes flickered open. Those silver, unnervingly still eyes. And he was listening. He was hearing it too. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, weaving through the fog, slithering into our campsite like the silver mist itself. Timmy, come back. Come home. Timmy stirred, his body tensing, his gaze fixed on the direction of the lake. He started to rise, slowly, mechanically, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Mom, still half asleep, murmured, "Timmy, honey, where are you going?" He didn't answer her, didn't even look at her. He just kept walking, drawn towards the whispering lake, his small figure disappearing into the fog. "Timmy," I yelled, scrambling to my feet, adrenaline surging through me, banishing the last vestiges of sleep. "Dad, Mom, he's going back to the lake." Dad was instantly awake, his eyes snapping open, his body reacting with a speed that belied his weariness. He saw Timmy disappearing into the fog, heard the whispering that was now audible even to our ears, and understood instantly the terrifying gravity of the situation. "Timmy, no!" he roared, leaping to his feet and giving chase, plunging into the fog after my brother's retreating figure. I followed close behind, Mom stumbling after us, her face pale with terror. The fog was thick, disorienting, swallowing sound and light. We stumbled blindly through the gray haze, Dad calling Timmy's name, his voice echoing eerily in the dense fog. The whispering was louder now, closer, a chorus of sibilant voices murmuring Timmy's name, beckoning him back to the lake. We reached the water's edge, the fog swirling around us, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The lake itself was invisible, hidden beneath a blanket of white mist that was just as unnatural and oppressive as the silver one had been. But the whispering was coming from there, from the heart of the fog, from the unseen water beyond. "Timmy," Dad yelled again, his voice strained with desperation. "Timmy, where are you?" And then, through the fog, we saw him, or rather, we saw it. Standing at the very edge of the lake, his small figure silhouetted against the pale gray light of dawn, was Timmy. But it wasn't Timmy. Not anymore. His back was to us, but even from behind, we could see the wrongness. His posture was too stiff, too rigid, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, and emanating from him, from his very being, was a faint silvery luminescence, a subtle shimmer that pulsed in the fog, echoing the unnatural light of the mist from the day before. He turned slowly, deliberately, to face us. And in the dim, fog-filtered light, we saw his face. It was Timmy's face, yes, but distorted. His skin was too pale, almost translucent, his features too sharp, too defined, and his eyes were no longer silver-tinged. They were pure silver now, solid, reflective orbs that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. They were like mirrors, perfectly polished, perfectly empty, and from his lips, that unsettling wrong smile spread again, wider this time, more deliberate, more predatory, and he spoke. But it wasn't Timmy's voice that emerged. It was a chorus of voices, sibilant whispers layered on top of each other, echoing and resonating in the fog, cold, ancient, and utterly alien. "He's home," the voice whispered, or rather, the voices whispered, speaking through Timmy's mouth, using his vocal cords, but utterly, terrifyingly not him. "He's back where he belongs, in the mirror. With us." And then it lunged. Not Timmy, not exactly. But it, the thing wearing Timmy's shape, moved with unnatural speed, faster than any 8-year-old boy could ever move. It launched itself towards the lake, towards the heart of the fog, towards the unseen water beyond. Dad reacted instantly, lunging forward to grab him, to stop him, but he was too slow. It was too fast. It reached the water's edge, plunged into the fog-shrouded lake, and vanished. Not with a splash, not with a ripple, but with a silent, seamless merging, like silver dissolving back into silver. Dad reached the spot where Timmy had been standing, his hand grasping at empty air, his face a mask of despair and disbelief. He stood there for a long moment, frozen, staring into the swirling fog, the whispering voices now fading, receding back into the depths of the lake, leaving only silence in their wake. Then slowly, he turned back to us, his face etched with a grief so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. He shook his head, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. "He's gone," he whispered, the words barely audible above the rustling fog. "He's really gone." Mom collapsed, sinking to her knees, a strangled sob escaping her lips. I stood there, numb, frozen, staring out at the fog-shrouded lake, at the empty space where Timmy had stood, where he had vanished, swallowed by the mist once more. The natural fog eventually dissipated with the rising sun, revealing Mirror Lake, once again, serene and still, reflecting the clear blue sky. The silver mist was gone, completely vanished, as if it had never been. The birds started to chirp again, the forest sounds returned, the campground slowly came back to life. Everything was normal, except Timmy was gone and he wasn't coming back. Not the real Timmy anyway. We left Mirror Lake that day, packing up our campsite in a daze of grief and shock. The Winnebago felt empty, silent, the usual boisterous energy of our family camping trips replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. Buster whimpered softly in the back, sensing our sorrow, sensing the absence that had ripped a hole in the heart of our family. We never spoke of it again, not really. The unspoken horror of Mirror Lake hung between us, a silent, invisible presence that haunted our every waking moment. We tried to move on, to return to our normal lives, but nothing was ever the same. The laughter was quieter, the smiles less frequent, the joy diminished. We were a family fractured, broken by something we couldn't understand, something we couldn't explain, something that had reached out from the misty depths of a seemingly serene lake and stolen a piece of our souls. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and the shadows are long, I still hear it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind, a sibilant murmur that calls my name, or maybe Timmy's, or maybe just anyone who will listen. A whisper from the mirror, from the mist, from the other side. A whisper that promises beautiful things, secrets of the lake, secrets of the woods, secrets of everything. A whisper that beckons you closer, closer to the edge, closer to the silver shimmer, closer to the place where reflections wave back, and sometimes pull you in. And I know with a chilling certainty that will never leave me, that Mirror Lake is still there, hidden in the Appalachians, still serene, still untouched, still waiting. And the mist will rise again. It always does. And it will be waiting, waiting for someone else to look too closely into its silvery depths, waiting for someone else to hear its whispers, waiting for you. My name's Jake, just Jake. No fancy last name needed when you spend as much time off the grid as I do. And let me tell you, I spend a lot of time off the grid. RV life, you know? It's not for everyone, I get it. Tiny house on wheels, always moving, always fixing something that just broke down. But for me, it's freedom. Pure, unadulterated freedom. The kind where your backyard changes every week, and the only boss you answer to is the open road. I've been doing this for, must be close to 5 years now. Sold my condo, packed what mattered into my rig, a cozy little Class C I call Wanderlust, and hit the blacktop. Haven't looked back since. I've seen more sunsets than I can count, slept under skies blazing with stars you can't even imagine in the city, and smelled more pine trees than a lumberjack convention. From the dusty deserts of Arizona to the misty coast of Maine, Wanderlust and I have been there. Or at least, almost everywhere. The Appalachians were still a big, beautiful blank spot on my mental map. Time to fix that. Roan Mountain had been whispering to me for a while. Heard stories, seen pictures online, those panoramic views, the balds, the history. It sounded like exactly my kind of place. Remote, rugged, and steeped in that old mountain mystery. So I pointed Wanderlust south, fueled up, and set my sights on the Tennessee-North Carolina border. The drive itself was a treat. Those winding, mountain roads, the air getting crisper and cooler with every mile, the trees closing in overhead like a green cathedral. I love that feeling, that sense of leaving the everyday world behind and entering something older, something wilder. I'd booked a spot at a campground near the summit, figured I'd treat myself to hookups for a night or two before really diving into the backcountry. Pulled into the campground late afternoon. Nice enough place, not too crowded, mostly tents, and smaller rigs. Wanderlust felt a little out of place amongst all the pop-ups, but she parked up just fine. Got myself checked in, hooked up the water and electric, and then I saw it, the mist. It wasn't just fog, not really. I've seen fog before, plenty of times. This was different, thicker, whiter, denser than anything I'd ever encountered. It clung to the mountain like a shroud, swallowing the peaks, blurring the trees and muting all sound. It wasn't rolling in or lifting or doing any of the things normal mist does. It was just there, solid, impenetrable, and unnervingly still. I stood outside Wanderlust, sipping a lukewarm coffee, just staring at it. The campground was perched pretty high up already, but the summit itself was completely invisible, lost in that endless white. Other campers were milling about, some looking a bit uneasy, others just shrugging it off. Kids were still running around, yelling and laughing, their voices strangely muffled by the mist. I overheard a couple of guys talking near the check-in cabin. "Been like this all day," one of them was saying, shaking his head. "Park ranger said it's unusual even for Roan Mountain. Just rolled in this morning and hasn't budged." "Think it'll clear up?" the other guy asked, sounding hopeful. The first guy just snorted. "Around here? Could be hours, could be days. Mountain weather, man. Unpredictable as a politician." Days? That gave me pause. I'd only planned a short, stay here maybe 3 or 4 days max before moving on. Spending the whole time socked in with zero visibility wasn't exactly my idea of a mountain adventure. But then again, there was something about that mist, something compelling. It wasn't just eerie, it was beautiful in a strange, unsettling way. That pure, unbroken white swallowing everything, creating this silent, isolated world. It was like the mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something. I'm not usually one for sitting around and waiting, especially not when there's hiking to be done. And Roan Mountain is famous for its hiking, specifically the Appalachian Trail, which runs right across the summit, the AT legendary. I'd always wanted to hike a section of it. Maybe this was my chance. Stupid idea, I know. Even as the thought popped into my head, a little voice in the back of my brain was screaming, "Don't be an idiot, Jake." But The other voice, the louder one, the one that always gets me into trouble, was saying, "Come on, man, how bad could it be?" Famous last words, right? I told myself it wouldn't be a serious hike. Just a little jaunt, a quick taste of the AT, a chance to stretch my legs after the drive. I'd stick close to the summit, maybe just follow the trail for an hour or two, then turn back. No problem. Experienced RV camper, remember? I've handled worse than a little mist. Famous second last words. I changed into my hiking boots, grabbed my backpack, water, snacks, first aid kit, compass, map, the usual, and stepped out into the white. The air was cold, damp, and strangely still. The mist pressed in on me immediately, a physical presence, swallowing the campground in seconds. Within maybe 50 feet of Wanderlust, I couldn't see it anymore. Just white. Everywhere. It was disorienting, to say the least. Sound seemed muffled. Direction became meaningless. The world had shrunk down to a circle of maybe 20 feet around me. Everything beyond that, swallowed by the white void. I pulled out my compass just to get a general sense of direction. North was, well, northish, according to the wildly spinning needle anyway. Great. I found the trailhead easily enough, marked by a wooden sign barely visible through the mist. Appalachian Trail, White Rocks Bald, 2.5 miles. 2.5 miles to the Bald. Sounded perfect for a short hike. I took a deep breath, told myself I was being sensible and cautious, and stepped onto the trail. The path was well worn, easy to follow even in the low visibility. At first it was kinda cool, honestly, like walking through a cloud. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional drip of moisture from the trees. The trees themselves were ghostly shapes, their branches disappearing into the white above. It was surreal, peaceful in a way, a little too peaceful maybe. I hiked for maybe half an hour, maybe a bit longer. I wasn't really keeping track of time. The mist had a way of making time feel fluid, distorted. I passed a few landmarks. A gnarled old tree with a distinctive split trunk, a cluster of oddly shaped rocks, a small stream trickling across the path. I made mental notes of them just in case. Always good to know your way back, right? Even on a short hike. Then things started to get weird. I rounded a bend in the trail and there it was again. The gnarled old tree with the split trunk. I frowned. Had I somehow circled back? Impossible. I'd been following the trail heading steadily uphill. I checked my compass again, still spinning like crazy, useless. Okay, maybe I just misremembered. Maybe there were two trees that looked similar. Roan Mountain was full of trees after all. I kept walking, a little faster now, a little more focused. I wanted to reach White Rocks Bald, get a view, even a misty one, and then head back to Wanderlust for a late lunch. A few minutes later I saw them again. The oddly shaped rocks. The same cluster. The same arrangement. I stopped dead in my tracks. This wasn't right. I knew I hadn't turned around. I'd been going forward. Always forward. But these landmarks, they were the same ones I'd passed earlier. No doubt about it. A cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. This wasn't just fog. This wasn't just disorientation. Something was wrong. Seriously wrong. I kept walking now with a growing sense of panic. I started paying even closer attention to my surroundings. Every twist and turn of the trail, every rock, every tree, every little detail. I was determined to prove to myself that I wasn't just imagining things. And then I saw the stream again. The same little trickle of water, the same moss-covered stones on either side. I'd crossed this stream maybe 15 minutes ago. How could I be back here already? Unless the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was walking in circles. But not just any circles, these were guided circles. Like something was deliberately leading me back to the same spots over and over again. Something in the mist. The cheerful, how bad could it be, bravado I'd started with evaporated instantly, replaced by a raw, primal fear. This wasn't just a hiking mishap. This wasn't just getting lost in the fog. This was something else, something unnatural, something predatory. The mist wasn't just mist. It was a dimension, a trap, and I was inside it, and I wasn't alone. Dimension. That was the only word that fit. Dimension. Not fog, not mist, not even some weird weather phenomenon. This was something else entirely. Something that bent the rules of reality, twisted space, and played tricks on your mind. And I was smack dab in the middle of it. Panic started to bubble up hot and acidic in my chest. I tried to take deep breaths, to calm myself down, to think rationally. Experienced RV camper, remember? Stay calm, assess the situation, find a solution. That's the mantra, right? Except, rationality felt like it was slipping away, dissolving in the white nothingness around me. This wasn't a situation I could logic my way out of. This was something other. The daylight was fading. I could feel it, even though there was no sun, visible through the perpetual white. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, the sense of isolation more profound. I glanced at my watch. Damn. Almost 5 p.m. Sunset couldn't be too far off, even in these mountains. And what happened when night fell in a dimension of mist I didn't want to find out. Okay, think, Jake, think. Compass is useless, map is useless, landmarks are repeating, logic is failing. What else have I got? My voice. Maybe someone in the campground could hear me if I shouted loud enough. Worth a shot, right? Anything was worth a shot at this point. Help! I yelled, my voice cracking, with a mixture of fear and desperation. Help, is anyone out there? I'm lost, I need help. Silence. Absolute unbroken silence. My shout seemed to vanish the instant it left my lips, swallowed by the mist, absorbed by the white void. It was like shouting into cotton wool. No echo, no response, just nothing. My voice was just another sound, instantly erased. I tried. Again. Louder this time, straining my vocal cords until they burned. Help! Campground! Anyone! Still nothing. Just the oppressive silence, the damp chill, and the endless mocking white. My shouts felt pathetic, futile, swallowed by the very thing that had trapped me. I was alone, completely, utterly alone, lost in a dimension of mist with no compass, no direction, and no hope of being heard. Despair started to creep in, cold and insidious, wrapping around me like the mist itself. It whispered in my ear, telling me it was hopeless, that I was trapped, that no one was coming to save me. It urged me to just give up, to sit down, to succumb to the white embrace. But something inside me, some stubborn, stupid spark of defiance, refused to let go. I wasn't going to just lie down and die in this fog bank from hell. I was Jake, the experienced RV camper. I'd faced down flat tires in the desert, raging storms on the coast, and grumpy park rangers with equal measures of grit and charm. I wasn't going to be defeated by a bit of mist, even if it was a dimension-bending, sanity-eating bit of mist. Okay, new plan. Logic and shouting hadn't worked. Time for brute force. If I couldn't find my way back, maybe I could just force my way out. Maybe if I just kept walking in a straight line, eventually I'd break through this barrier. Maybe, just maybe, the repeating landmarks were only on the trail. Maybe if I went off trail into the woods, I could find a way out. It was a long shot, I knew. Probably a stupid one. But I was running out of options, and staying on the trail was clearly just leading me in circles. So, I took a deep breath, picked a direction, what I thought was downhill based on the vague slope of the ground, and plunged off the trail into the trees. The woods were even denser off the path. The mist was thicker here, clinging to the undergrowth, dripping from the branches. Visibility was even worse, if that was possible. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and fallen branches. I stumbled and tripped, pushing through thickets of rhododendron, scratching my hands and face on unseen thorns. It was slow going, exhausting work. But I kept pushing, kept moving, driven by that desperate hope that I was heading in the right direction, that I was breaking free of the loop. I kept telling myself, just keep walking, Jake, just keep walking. And for a while it seemed to be working. I wasn't seeing the same landmarks anymore. No gnarled tree, no oddly shaped rocks, no stream. Just trees, mist, and the increasingly uneven ground. Maybe I was actually getting somewhere. Maybe I was actually escaping. Then I stumbled. My foot caught on something hidden under the leaves, and I went down hard, sprawling on the damp ground. Pain shot up my ankle, sharp and immediate. Damn, it! I cursed, pushing myself up, wincing as I put weight on my left leg. Twisted it, maybe sprained it. Great, just what I needed. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, rubbing my throbbing ankle. Despair threatened to engulf me again, stronger this time. Lost, alone, injured, and trapped in a dimension of mist. Things were definitely not looking good. As I sat there trying to gather my strength, I noticed something familiar, a shape looming out of the white just a few feet away, tall, dark, and gnarled. No, it couldn't be. Not again. I pushed myself to my feet, ignoring the pain in my ankle, and limped closer. And there it was. The gnarled old tree with the split trunk, the same damn tree. The one I'd passed on the trail. The one I thought I'd left behind miles ago. I stared at it, my mind reeling, my heart sinking. It was impossible. I'd gone off trail, into the woods. I'd been walking in a straight line, or what I thought was a straight line. How could I be back here? How could the same landmark, the same tree, have reappeared in the middle of nowhere? Unless it wasn't just the trail that was looping. Unless the entire dimension was looping. Unless no matter which direction I went, no matter how far I walked, I was always being guided back to the same damn spots. Like a rat in a maze, except the maze was made of mist, and the rat was me. The realization was crushing. It stole what little hope I had left, leaving behind a cold, empty void. I sank to my knees beside the tree, the damp ground seeping through my jeans, the chill biting into my bones. Exhaustion, fear, and despair weighed me down, heavy and suffocating. I felt like giving up, like just curling up against the tree and letting the mist take me. But even as I teetered on the edge of surrender, something else broke through the silence. Something faint, almost imperceptible at first. A sound. A rhythmic sound. Distant, muffled, but definitely there. Thump, thump, thump. It was like drumming. A slow, steady, almost hypnotic beat echoing through the mist. It was so faint, so distant that I almost dismissed it as my imagination, as the frantic pounding of my own heart. But it persisted, growing slightly louder, slightly clearer with each passing moment. Thump, thump, thump. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the white void, from further up the mountain, from somewhere beyond the repeating landmarks. beyond the looping trail, beyond everything. It was a sound from the heart of the mist itself. I lifted, my head straining my ears, focusing all my attention on the sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was definitely drumming, but not like any drumming I'd ever heard before. There was something ancient about it, something primal, something unsettling. But it was also something, anything. In this silent white world, any sound, any sign of something else was a lifeline, a sliver of hope in the overwhelming despair. Maybe, just maybe, this drumming was a way out. Maybe it was a signal. Maybe it was someone. Logic screamed at me to stay put, to conserve my energy, to wait for rescue, even though I knew deep down that rescue wasn't coming. Reason told me that following a mysterious, drumming sound in a dimension of mist was the stupidest, most reckless thing I could possibly do. But reason had already failed me. Logic had led me in circles. Shouting had been swallowed by the silence. Brute force had only brought me back to the same damn tree. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to abandon logic and reason altogether. Maybe it was time to embrace the madness, the drumming continued, steady and hypnotic, pulling me in, beckoning me deeper into the white void. Thump, thump, thump. It was a faint sound, a fragile hope, a whisper in the overwhelming silence. But it was something, and in this endless white, something was all I had. Driven by a sliver of hope, or perhaps just pure, unadulterated madness, I made a decision. I was going to follow the sound. I was going to follow the drumming, wherever it led. Even if it led deeper into the mist. Even if it led to whatever was waiting for me in the heart of this white hell. I pushed myself to my feet again, ignoring the pain in my ankle, and turned towards the sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was faint, but it was there. A rhythmic pulse in the silence, a guide in the white void. And with a deep breath and a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, I started walking towards it, walking deeper into the endless white of Roan Mountain. Following the drumming was like walking towards a ghost. The sound was always just ahead of me, just out of reach, always promising to lead me somewhere, but never quite getting any closer. Thump, thump, thump. It pulsed through the mist, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the otherwise silent world. It was my only guide, my only focus, the only thing keeping me moving forward. My ankle throbbed with every step, a dull, persistent ache that radiated up my leg. The uneven ground made each footfall a gamble. I stumbled constantly, catching myself on unseen roots and rocks, my progress agonizingly slow. But I kept going. I had to keep going. The drumming was my only hope now, the only thing between me and complete despair. The landscape around me continued to shift and blur, or perhaps it was my mind that was blurring. It was hard to tell anymore. The trees seemed to grow taller, their shapes more twisted and grotesque, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The mist itself seemed to thicken, becoming almost viscous, like wading through cold white syrup. It clung to me, heavy and damp, chilling me to the bone despite my layers of clothing. Time continued to lose all meaning. I had no idea how long I'd been walking, how far I'd gone. Hours, maybe? Or just minutes stretched out into an eternity by the oppressive mist and the relentless drumming. It felt like I'd been walking forever, lost in this white purgatory, chasing a sound that might not even be real. And then the landmark started again. Subtly at first, almost like my mind was playing tricks on me. A strangely shaped boulder, half hidden in the mist. Hadn't I seen that before? Or something like it? I couldn't be sure. My memory felt hazy, unreliable, like it was being eroded by the mist itself. Then, another one. A fallen log, draped in moss, lying across my path. Definitely familiar, too familiar. The unease returned stronger this time, a cold dread creeping up my spine. Was I looping again? Even off trail, even following the drumming, was I still being led in circles? I stopped walking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding against my ribs. Thump, thump, thump. The drumming continued, steady and unwavering, seemingly oblivious to my growing panic. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, trying to make sense of the swirling white chaos around me. And that's when I saw it. Or rather, them. Shapes. Vague, indistinct shapes moving in the mist, just at the edge of my vision, just beyond, the veil of white. Glimpses of movement, fleeting shadows, something there. But whenever I tried to focus on them, to get a clearer look, they vanished, dissolving back into the mist, leaving me questioning if I'd seen anything at all. But I had seen them. I knew I had. And they were moving, circling, watching. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me. I wasn't alone in the mist. I hadn't been alone for a long time. Something else was here. Something was guiding me in circles. Something was drumming, and now something was watching. The drumming seemed to change then, or maybe it was just my perception, warped by fear, but it felt closer, louder, more insistent, and the rhythm, it wasn't just a steady beat anymore. It was becoming more complex, more intricate, almost musical, if you could call something so primal and unsettling musical. Thump, 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 thump. The rhythm pulsed and shifted, echoing through the mist, vibrating in my bones. It was hypnotic, mesmerizing, drawing me in, pulling me deeper. And the shapes in the mist, they seemed to move with the rhythm, swirling and swaying like dancers in a ghostly ballet. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to flee, to get as far away from this place as possible. But run where? Back to the repeating landmarks? Back into the looping dimension? There was nowhere to run to. And the drumming, it held me captive. It was fear, yes, but it was also something else. A strange, morbid curiosity. A desperate, irrational hope that this sound, this drumming held the key to escaping this white hell. So I kept walking, towards the sound, towards the shapes, towards whatever was waiting for me in the heart of the mist. My injured ankle screamed in protest, my body ached with exhaustion, my mind teetered on the brink of madness. But I kept putting one foot in, front of the other, driven by the hypnotic drumming and the terrifying certainty that there was no turning back. As I walked, the mist seemed to thin, just a little, or maybe my eyes were adjusting to the perpetual white. But I started to see things more clearly. The shapes in the mist were still vague, indistinct, but they were becoming more defined, more solid, less like shadows, more like forms.
They were close now, just a few feet away. I could see details now, horrifying details. Their hands. They were long and skeletal, with fingers that seemed impossibly elongated, tipped with sharp black claws. And their robes. They weren't robes at all. They were skin. Pale white skin stretched taut over their gaunt frames, clinging to them like a shroud. Skin that seemed to ripple and flow like the mist itself and the drumming. It wasn't coming from them. It was coming from behind them, from deeper within the mist, from somewhere beyond the figures, from the heart of this white dimension. The figures were just escorts, guiding me to something else, something. Worse, the drumming reached a fever pitch, a frantic, pounding crescendo. Thump, 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 thump. And the figures, they reached out. There. Long skeletal hands extended towards me, their black claws glinting in the white light. I closed my eyes, bracing for the touch, for whatever horror awaited me. This was it, the end of the line. Jake, the experienced RV camper, lost and devoured by the endless white of Roan Mountain. Famous last words indeed, but the touch never came. Instead, there was silence. Sudden, absolute silence. The drumming stopped. The figures stopped. The mist seemed to recede. I slowly opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest, my body trembling from head to toe. The figures were still there, just a few feet away, frozen in place, their skeletal hands still outstretched. But the mist, it was thinning, just a little, but definitely thinning. And in the distance, through the swirling white, I saw something. Something that wasn't white. Something dark. A shape. A massive, looming shape rising out of the mist. Dark, solid, and impossibly huge. It was like a mountain, but not a mountain. Something else, something ancient and terrible, waiting in the heart of the white void. And the figures, they were pointing towards it, guiding me towards it, towards whatever was waiting for me in the darkness. The drumming had stopped, but the silence was somehow even more terrifying, because in that silence I knew what the drumming had been leading me to. I knew what the figures were escorting me towards. And I knew with a bone-chilling certainty that there was no escape. I was being led to something ancient, something powerful, something hungry. And the endless white of Roan Mountain was just the beginning. The darkness loomed. It wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the mist. It was a palpable void, a gaping maw in the white nothingness, swallowing light, sound, and hope itself. It rose before me, impossibly vast, an obsidian monolith against the swirling white, defying all sense of scale and perspective. This was the destination. This was what the drumming had been leading me to. This was the heart of the mountain. The figures stood motionless beside me, silent sentinels, their skeletal hands still outstretched, pointing towards the darkness. They didn't need to speak. Their purpose was clear. They were guides, escorts, leading me to it, whatever it was. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that it was waiting. The silence was deafening now, a thick, oppressive blanket that smothered all sound. The drumming was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness that amplified the pounding of my own heart, the rasp of my own breath. Even the rustling of the wind, the drip of moisture from the trees all gone. Just silence. And the looming darkness. I took a hesitant step forward, my injured ankle protesting with a sharp stab of pain. The figures didn't move, didn't react. They simply remained there, statues of white dread, their unseen eyes fixed on the darkness, and by extension, on me. I was the one who had to move. I was the one being led to the slaughter with a deep breath and a silent farewell to any semblance of hope. I started walking towards the darkness. Each step was heavy, leaden, as if the mist itself was trying to hold me back, to warn me away from the abyss. But the pull of the darkness was stronger, a morbid curiosity, a fatalistic acceptance of my doom, driving me forward. As I approached, the darkness began to resolve itself, to take shape. It wasn't just a void. It was a structure, massive, ancient, and utterly alien. It was built of something dark and smooth, like polished obsidian or petrified bone. Its surfaces were strangely curved and angled, defying Euclidean geometry, hinting at dimensions beyond human comprehension. It wasn't built, not in any way I understood building. It seemed to have grown from the mountain itself, a tumorous outgrowth of rock and shadow, and it was huge, absolutely colossal. It dwarfed the trees, dwarfed the mountain itself, seeming to stretch up into the swirling white, disappearing into the endless mist above. I craned my neck, trying to see the top, but it was lost in the white void, swallowed by the same mist that had trapped me. It was like staring at the flank of some sleeping god, a being of unimaginable scale and power, slumbering in the heart of Roan Mountain. As I got closer, I started to discern details on its surface. Strange carvings, or perhaps natural formations, snaked across the dark stone, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in my peripheral vision. They weren't symbols, not anything I recognized. They were more like veins or nerves, pulsing with some unseen energy, some dark, inner life. And then I saw the opening. A gaping maw in the side of the structure, a jagged tear in the dark stone, leading into absolute blackness. It wasn't a door or a gateway or anything remotely human-made. It was more like a raw, gaping orifice in the side of this monstrous edifice. And it was breathing. Faintly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely breathing. A slow, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation, like the sigh of some ancient, slumbering beast. The drumming started again. Faintly at first, then growing louder, more insistent, echoing from within the darkness of the opening. Thump, thump, thump. It was closer now, much closer, resonating in my chest, vibrating in my bones. It was coming from inside the structure. From the heart of the darkness, the figures beside me stirred, their white forms shifting slightly, their skeletal hands now pointing directly at the opening. This was it, the final destination, the end of the journey. The culmination of whatever. Dark purpose had drawn me into the mist, terror warred with a strange, morbid fascination. I was terrified, yes, more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. But I was also compelled, drawn in, hypnotized by the darkness, by the drumming, by the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of it all. It was like staring into the abyss, and finding the abyss staring back, beckoning me closer, I limped towards the opening, my injured ankle throbbing, my body trembling, my mind numb with fear and a weird, detached curiosity. The figures glided silently beside me, escorts to my doom, their white forms stark against the encroaching darkness. The drumming grew louder, louder, until it filled my entire world, drowning out all thought, all reason, all resistance. Thump, 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 thump. I reached the opening. The air round it was cold, colder than the mist, a bone-chilling, unnatural cold that seeped into me, extinguishing any remaining warmth. The darkness within was absolute, impenetrable, a void that seemed to swallow light itself. I couldn't see anything inside, not even the faintest glimmer, just blackness. Complete and utter blackness. The figures stopped at the edge of the opening, their white forms stark against the dark stone. They turned to face me, their unseen faces still shrouded in shadow, their skeletal hands still outstretched. This was as far as they would go. The rest was up to me. The drumming reached its crescendo, a deafening, frantic roar that seemed to shake the very mountain. Thump, 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 thump. And then silence. Sudden, absolute silence. Again, in that silence, I knew. This was the point of no return. If I stepped into that darkness, there was no coming back. This was the heart of the mountain, and whatever was waiting for me inside. It wasn't going to let me leave, but I also knew that I had no choice. I had been led here, guided, drawn in by something ancient and powerful. Turning back was no longer an option. There was nowhere to turn back to. The mist had erased the path behind me, swallowed the world I knew, leaving only this darkness, this silence, this invitation.so. With a final shuddering breath, I stepped into the opening, into the darkness, into the heart of Roan Mountain. The cold was immediate, intense, like stepping into a freezer. The darkness was absolute, complete, swallowing all light, all vision. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I was blind, utterly blind, in a darkness so profound it felt, physical, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. But the drumming, it was still there, faintly now, muffled by the darkness, but still present. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from deeper within, from further into the structure. Beckoning me onward, I started to walk, blindly, cautiously, my hands outstretched, feeling my way through the darkness. The ground underfoot was uneven, rocky, sloping downwards. The air was thick, heavy, and strangely still. No breeze, no movement, just a suffocating stillness that pressed in on me from all sides. The drumming grew louder as I descended, echoing through the darkness, resonating in the stone around me. Thump, thump, thump. It was no longer just a sound. It was a vibration, a pulse, a living presence in the darkness. And as I walked deeper, I began to feel something else. Something. watching not the figures. They were gone, left behind. At the opening, this was something else. Something in the darkness. Unseen, unheard, but undeniably present. A sense of being watched, scrutinized, judged by something ancient and unknowable. It was a feeling that crawled under my skin, raised the hairs on the back of my neck, and sent shivers of primal fear down my spine. The drumming changed again. Slower now, more deliberate, less frantic, more ceremonial. Thump, thump, thump. Each beat was heavy, resonant, echoing through the darkness like the tolling of some subterranean bell. And with each beat, the sense of being watched intensified. The darkness seemed to deepen, the cold grew more profound, and then I saw it, or rather felt it. A change in the darkness, a subtle shift in the texture of the void, a faint glow, not light, not exactly, more like a dim luminescence emanating from the darkness itself, like the faintest phosphorescence in the deepest ocean trench. The glow grew stronger as I walked, slowly, gradually, until it was no longer just a faint luminescence, but a dim, pervasive light, revealing something. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, vague and indistinct at first, then slowly resolving themselves into forms, walls, columns, arches, a vast subterranean chamber carved out of the living rock, stretching away into the darkness in all directions. The structure wasn't just an outgrowth on the mountain. It was inside the mountain, a hidden underground labyrinth bathed in a strange, cold internal light, and in the center of the chamber, bathed in the dim, unearthly glow, was it, the source of the drumming, the thing that had been calling to me, guiding me, drawing me deeper into the mountain, the thing that the figures had been escorting me to, the thing that had been waiting in the darkness. It was a heart, but not a heart like any heart I had ever seen or even imagined. It was colossal, massive, filling the center of the chamber, pulsating with a slow, rhythmic beat. Thump, thump, thump. The drumming wasn't just a sound. It was the heartbeat of this thing, this ancient subterranean entity, this heart of the mountain. It was made of something organic, yet also mineral, like petrified flesh or living stone. Its surface was veined and ridged, pulsing with that same faint luminescence that illuminated the chamber. Strange tendrils, like arteries or roots, snaked out from its base, disappearing into the darkness, anchoring it to the mountain itself, and it was alive, undeniably, terrifyingly alive, pulsing, beating, breathing in the heart of the mountain, in the heart of the mist, in the heart of this endless white hell. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at it, my mind unable to comprehend what I was seeing. This was beyond anything I could have imagined, anything I could have conceived of. This was something ancient, something primordial, something that should not exist, but did, in the heart of Roan Mountain, and then it saw me, or rather sensed me. There were no eyes, not that I could see, but I felt its awareness turn towards me, a vast, ancient consciousness focusing its attention on my tiny, insignificant form. It was like being looked at by a mountain, judged by a god. The drumming changed again. Slower now, even more deliberate. More expectant. Thump, thump, thump. And the luminescence of the heart intensified, bathing the chamber in a brighter, colder glow. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was waiting. Waiting for me. Waiting to see what I would do. I stood there for a long moment, frozen in place, staring at the heart of the mountain, feeling its ancient gaze upon me. And then, slowly, deliberately, I took another step forward, towards the heart, towards the darkness, towards whatever awaited me in the endless white of Roan Mountain, because in that moment, I understood. The mist wasn't just a trap. It was a veil, a barrier between worlds. And the drumming wasn't just a sound. It was a call, an invitation to something ancient, something powerful, something beyond human comprehension. And I, Jake, the experienced RV camper, had answered that call. And now I was here, in the heart of the mountain, ready to face whatever awaited me, ready to embrace the endless white, ready to become part of it. And as I took that final step, as I moved closer to the pulsating heart, the darkness seemed to welcome me. The cold intensified, the silence deepened, and the luminescence of the heart grew brighter, bathing me in its unearthly glow. And in that glow, in that darkness, in that silence, in the heart of Roan Mountain, I knew I was home. They call me Beth. It's just Beth. No last name needed, at least not for this story. And honestly, if you're reading this, you probably won't need to remember it for long anyway. I have a feeling this is the kind of story that sticks with you. Not the name of whoever it happened to, but for now, Beth will do. I guess you could say I have a thing for spooky stories. Always have. Ever since I was a kid huddled under the covers with a flashlight and a stack of Goosebumps books, I've been drawn to the things that go bump in the night, the whispers in the dark, the shivers that crawl up your spine and settle right there, between your shoulder blades. Most people are into sunshine and rainbows, puppies and kittens. Me? Give me shadows and silence, the rustle of unseen things in the woods, and a good, healthy dose of existential dread. Maybe it's a bit morbid, but hey, we all have our quirks.so. When I heard about graveyard fields in the Appalachians, especially during peak fog season, it sounded less like a camping trip and more like a personal invitation from the ghost stories themselves. I mean, the name alone, right? Graveyard fields. It practically screams, "Come get haunted." And then there's the description. Eerie. Stunted trees, frequent mists, a place steeped in local legends and whispered tales of things best left undisturbed. For someone like me, it was irresistible. I did my research, of course. I'm not completely reckless, just enthusiastically morbid. Graveyard Field sits right along the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina. Apparently, the name comes from the old logging days when the tree stumps left behind, combined with fire damage and the constant fog, made the area look like, well, a graveyard. Some folks say the Cherokee called it the place of the spirits. Others claim it's haunted by the ghosts of loggers, or maybe even something older, something that was there before the trees were cut down, before the parkway was built. Before anyone even thought to call it Graveyard Fields. The fog, though, that was the real draw. Peak fog season in the Appalachians is supposed to be something else. Thick, rolling mists that blanket the valleys, clinging to the mountainsides, turning everything into a monochrome landscape of gray and deeper gray. Perfect atmosphere for a spooky story, right? Perfect atmosphere for experiencing one. I figured .so. I packed up my RV affectionately nicknamed the Wanderer because originality isn't my strong suit and headed south. I loaded it with all the essentials: camping gear, enough snacks to survive a zombie apocalypse priorities, people, my trusty recording equipment, and, of course, a healthy collection of horror novels for nighttime reading. Because what's a spooky camping trip without some appropriately themed literature? The drive itself was beautiful, even before I got to the parkway. The mountains started rising up, getting taller and greener as I went, the air getting crisper and cleaner. By the time I turned onto the Blue Ridge Parkway, the views were breathtaking. Sweeping vistas of forested mountains, valleys stretching out as far as the eye could see, the kind of scenery that makes you feel small and insignificant in the best possible way. It was late afternoon when I finally reached the Graveyard Fields. Overlook. Even in the daylight, there was something off about the place. It wasn't just the stunted trees, though they certainly added to the unsettling vibe. They were these gnarled, twisted things, reaching up like skeletal fingers, their branches bare and stark against the sky. They looked old, ancient almost, like they'd seen things they shouldn't have, and were forever marked by it. The landscape was open, almost barren in places, with wide meadows of tall grasses interspersed with these clumps of twisted trees. It was beautiful in a desolate, haunting kind of way, like a landscape painter's rendition of a nightmare. And then there was the air. It was still, almost unnaturally so. Even though it was late summer, there wasn't much of a breeze. The leaves on the trees barely rustled, and the tall grasses in the meadows stood motionless. It was a heavy, expectant stillness, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Or maybe waiting for something to come. I parked the Wanderer in one of the designated RV spots at the Graveyard Fields trailhead. There were a few other cars and trucks scattered around, mostly hikers, I guessed, getting ready to hit the trails. But there was a noticeable lack of other campers. Maybe everyone else had more sense than me. Or maybe they just weren't as into spooky stories. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp, getting everything organized inside the RV, and taking a short walk around the immediate area. I wanted to get a feel for the place, to soak in the atmosphere before nightfall. The trails were easy enough, well maintained and clearly marked, winding through the meadows and into patches of woods. I followed one that led to a small waterfall, tumbling down moss-covered rocks into a clear, cold pool. Even there, by the sound of rushing water, the stillness of the air was palpable. It was like the sounds themselves were muted, somehow less vibrant than they should have been. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the temperature started to drop sharply. The air grew colder, damper, and a low mist began to form in the valleys below. It started as just a faint haze, clinging to the lower ground, but it thickened quickly, tendrils reaching up the mountainsides, creeping closer to where I was parked. The hikers started to trickle back to the parking lot, their voices hushed, their movements quicker, as if they too felt the change in the air. Soon I was alone. The last car pulled out, taillights disappearing down the parkway, leaving me and the wanderer in complete solitude. Just me, the stunted trees, and the gathering mist. Back inside the RV, I lit a couple of lanterns, casting a warm yellow glow against the darkening interior. I made myself a simple dinner, canned soup and a sandwich, gourmet camping fare, and settled down to read. I'd brought a collection of classic ghost stories: Poe, Lovecraft, MCR, James, the heavy hitters. Figured I'd get myself properly in the mood. But even with the lantern light and the familiar words on the page, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me since arriving. The mist was getting thicker now. I could see it swirling past the windows of the RV, a ghostly white curtain obscuring the outside world. The silence was deepening too, becoming almost oppressive. It wasn't just quiet. It was absence. Absence of bird song, absence of insect noises, absence of the usual night sounds of the forest. It was like the world outside had simply stopped making noise. I tried to ignore it, to lose myself in the stories, but the silence was too pervasive, too insistent. It seeped into the RV, through the walls, through the closed windows, filling every corner of the space. It was like being underwater, everything muffled, distant, unreal. Even the gentle hum of the RV's generator seemed muted, swallowed by the all-encompassing stillness. Finally, I put down my book. The stories weren't helping, not really. They were just amplifying the feeling of unease, mirroring the growing sense of dread that was tightening in my chest. I turned off the lanterns, plunging the RV into darkness, except for the faint glow of the digital clock on the microwave. 11:47 p.m. late, but not that late. Still, the night felt ancient, heavy with unspoken things. I went to the window, peering out into the mist. It was like looking into a cloud, a swirling, opaque white nothingness. I couldn't see the trees anymore, not even the closest ones. The world outside the wanderer had ceased to exist, replaced by this silent, white void. And then I noticed it. Or rather, I didn't notice it. Sound there was none. Absolutely none. Not even the faintest whisper of wind. No rustle of leaves. No distant animal call. Just silence. A silence so complete, so absolute, it was like being in a vacuum. I pressed my ear against the window, straining to hear something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the heavy, suffocating silence of the mist. It was unnatural. Fog can be thick. It can be disorienting, but it's never silent like this. There's always some sound, even if it's just the faint hiss of moisture in the air, the whisper of wind moving through the fog. But this was different. This was a silence that felt deliberate, like something had actively removed all sound from the world. A shiver ran down my spine, a cold, primal fear that had nothing to do with ghost stories and everything to do with something fundamentally wrong. This wasn't just mist. This was something else. Something wrong. I backed away from the window, heart pounding in my chest. The silence inside the RV suddenly felt different too, no longer just muffled, but absorbed. Like the mist wasn't just outside, but somehow seeping in, filling the space, stealing the sound even from within these thin metal walls. The hum of the generator was gone now. I realized, or so faint, it was imperceptible. Had it died? No. The lights were still on, dim but steady. The silence was just eating it. I moved to the front of the RV, peering through the windshield. Same thing. White, swirling mist. Absolute silence. It was like being adrift in a featureless ocean of white noise, except it wasn't noise. It was the opposite of noise. It was the absence of everything. And then a new sound. Or rather, a new lack of sound. I realized I couldn't hear myself breathing. Not even the faint rush of air in my nostrils, the subtle expansion of my lungs. Nothing. I held my hand in front of my face, waving it back and forth. No sound of movement. I shifted my weight from foot to foot. Silence. Complete, utter, terrifying silence. The mist wasn't just absorbing outside sounds. It was absorbing all sound. Even the sounds I was making myself, inside the RV, within my own body. It was like the mist was hungry, and sound was what it craved. And it was getting closer, closer to devouring everything, intrigued by the unnatural. Silence of the mist. Beth ventures out of her RV to record it. The silence becomes deafening, and she realizes the mist isn't just muting sound. It's consuming it, along with anything else that makes a noise. Her screams are swallowed by the mist as something emerges from the silence, my breath hitched in. My throat, or at least, I think it did. Hard to tell when you can't hear yourself breathe. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the morbid curiosity that had drawn me to graveyard fields in the first place. This wasn't spooky fun anymore. This was wrong. Deeply, terrifyingly wrong. I stumbled back from the windshield, away from the silent white world outside. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Mist that eats sound? That's not weather. That's something else. Something unnatural. Something dangerous. My first instinct, the one screaming loudest in my head, was to get out of there. Start the RV, get back on the parkway, drive until I was miles away. From this place, from this mist, from this suffocating silence. But another part of me, the morbidly curious part, the part that loved spooky stories a little too much, whispered, recorded. Are you insane? Get out. That was the louder voice, the saner voice, the one that probably had my best interests at heart. But the other voice, the creepy story enthusiast, was insistent. This was it, wasn't it? This was the real deal. A genuine, honest-to-goodness, unexplained, terrifying phenomenon unfolding right outside my door. How could I not record it? How could I walk away from something like this and not try to capture it, to understand it, to document it? Stupid, I know. Looking back, it's blindingly, forehead-slappingly stupid. But in that moment, huddled in the silent RV, with the white mist swirling outside and the unnatural quiet pressing in, the morbid curiosity won. Maybe it was the thrill seeker in me, the part that loved roller coasters and horror movies and jumping out from behind corners to scare my friends. Maybe it was just plain dumb luck. Whatever it was, I made the wrong choice. The deadly mistake, I told myself it would just be for a minute. Just step outside, hold out the recorder, capture the silence, and then get back inside and figure out what to do next. Escape plan later, recording first. That was the logic or lack thereof that propelled me into action. I rummaged around for my trusty handheld recorder, the one I'd brought specifically to capture the spooky sounds of graveyard fields. Irony, thy name is Beth. I found it on the counter, grabbed it, and checked the batteries. Full. Good. At least something was working as expected. I pressed record, the little red light blinking on, a tiny beacon of normalcy in the encroaching weirdness. Then I did something even stupider. I opened the RV door. The silence hit me like a physical force. It was colder outside than I expected, the damp mist clinging to my skin, sending shivers down my arms. But the cold was nothing compared to the silence. It was like stepping into a sensory deprivation chamber, except instead of just lacking sound, it felt like sound had been actively removed, erased, vaporized. The mist swirled around me, thick and white, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I could barely see the ground in front of my feet, let alone the twisted trees that I knew were lurking just beyond the edge of the RV. The wanderer itself seemed to shrink behind me, swallowed by the white void. I was alone, utterly and completely alone, in a world devoid of sound. I took a tentative step, then another, moving away from the RV, deeper into the mist. My boots crunched on the gravel path, a strangely loud sound in the oppressive quiet. But even that was quickly absorbed, the crunch fading away almost before it registered in my ears. It was like the mist was hungry for sound, devouring it the instant it was created. I raised the recorder, holding it out in front of me, the microphone pointed into the swirling white nothingness. Test, I whispered, my voice sounding weak and thin, strangely lifeless. Even my own whisper seemed to be sucked away, swallowed by the mist before it could travel more than a few inches. It was like speaking into a pillow, or maybe into a black hole. Sound went in, but nothing came out. The silence deepened. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It was something active. It felt like the silence itself was pressing against me, a heavy, tangible presence. It was like the air had thickened, not with moisture, but with Silence. A silence so profound it was almost deafening. Deafening silence. An oxymoron, sure, but that's exactly what it felt like. My ears were ringing, not with sound, but with the lack of it. It was a pressure, a void, a screaming nothingness that filled my head and made my teeth ache. Unease morphed into something darker, something colder. This wasn't just weird. It was malevolent. The silence wasn't just a phenomenon. It was a presence. A hungry, watchful presence that was aware of me, aware of my sounds, aware of my intrusion into its domain. And it didn't like it. I could feel it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the silence. A tightening, a focusing, like something was zeroing in on me. A prickle of fear danced across my skin, raising goosebumps on my arms and neck. My breath hitched again, or maybe it was just my imagination this time. Hard to tell what was real, and what was just my increasingly panicked mind conjuring up in this soundless void. But the feeling was undeniable. I was being watched. Not seen, maybe, not yet, but watched, sensed, hunted. The thought sent a jolt of pure terror through me. My legs wanted to move, to run, to bolt back to the safety of the RV, but they were frozen, locked in place by a fear so primal it short-circuited my brain. I was trapped, caught in the spotlight of this silent, unseen watcher, paralyzed by dread, and then I imagined screaming. Just a quick, sharp yell to test my theory, to see if the mist would really swallow even that. But the thought died stillborn in my throat. My vocal cords clamped shut, refusing to cooperate. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a deep, instinctive refusal, born of pure, unadulterated terror. Something inside me, something older and wiser than my conscious mind, knew that screaming was a bad idea. A very, very bad idea. It was like the silence itself was telling me to be quiet, warning me, don't make a sound. The message was clear, unspoken, but deafening in its intensity. And for the first time in my life, I listened to the silence. I clamped my mouth shut, held my breath, and stood as still as I possibly could, hoping, praying that whatever was out there, in the mist, in the silence, wouldn't notice me if I didn't make a sound. It was a futile hope. I knew that even as I clung to it, I was already making sounds, tiny sounds, the almost imperceptible rustle of my clothes, the faint thump-thump of my heart, the microscopic creaks and shifts of my body as I stood there, frozen in place. But maybe, just maybe, if I was quiet enough, still enough, it wouldn't consider me worth consuming. The silence stretched, elongated, becoming an eternity. Every second felt like a year, every heartbeat like a drumbeat in the void. My eyes strained to pierce the white mist, searching for something, anything. A shape, a shadow, a movement, anything to break the monotony of white and silence. But there was nothing, just mist, just silence, just the growing, suffocating dread that was threatening to crush me. And then it happened. From the heart of the consuming silence, something began to emerge. Not a sound, not at first, but a shift, A subtle disturbance in the fabric of the silence itself, like a ripple in a still pond or a tremor in solid ground. Something was moving somewhere out there in the mist, and it was moving without sound. The shift grew stronger, more defined. It was like the silence was yielding, parting, making way for something that was coming. And as the silence retreated, ever so slightly, a shape began to coalesce in the white mist. A vague, indistinct form at first, like a smudge in the fog, but growing clearer, more solid with each passing, agonizing second dot. A T was tall, impossibly tall, stretching up into the mist, its upper reaches lost in the swirling white. It was dark, darker than the deepest shadows, a black silhouette against the pale gray of the mist. And it was moving, gliding, flowing towards me with a silent, inexorable grace that was more terrifying than any roar or scream could ever be. As it moved, the silence around it seemed to deepen, to intensify, as if the creature itself was drawing the silence in, amplifying it, becoming a living embodiment of the void. The air grew colder, colder than the damp mist could account for, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my marrow and made my teeth chatter, silently, of course, and then I saw it clearly, or as clearly as the swirling mist would allow. It wasn't a tree, though it was vaguely tree-shaped, tall and thin, with branching appendages. But these weren't branches. They were too fluid, too organic. They writhed and shifted, not in the wind, because there was no wind, but independently, like tentacles or limbs and the surface of the thing. It wasn't bark. It was smooth, slick, black as polished obsidian, reflecting the faint, diffuse light of the mist in a way that was deeply unsettling. It shimmered almost like it was wet or alive. It had no discernible features, no face, no eyes, no mouth. Just this tall, black, vaguely tree-like shape, gliding silently through the mist. Its limbs writhing and reaching, and the silence, the absolute, consuming silence, radiating out from it like a palpable aura. It was close now, impossibly close, looming over me, blocking out the already limited visibility of the mist. I could feel its presence, a cold, heavy weight in the air, a sense of utter alien wrongness that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn. It was something that should not be, something born of nightmare and silence, something utterly and profoundly other. And then one of those writhing, black limbs reached out, slowly, deliberately, silently, reaching for me. My scream, the scream I had so carefully suppressed, finally broke free. But it was pointless. I knew it even as it tore from my throat, a raw, desperate sound that was instantly, utterly swallowed by the mist. There was no echo, no reverberation, no sound at all, just the brief, pathetic exhalation of air, and then nothing. My scream was gone, vanished as if it had never existed, consumed by the silent mist, just like everything else, and as my scream died, swallowed by the void, the black limb touched me. The touch was cold, not just the cold of the mist, but a deeper, more profound cold, like touching something that had been frozen for centuries, something that had never known warmth. It wasn't just physical cold either. It was a coldness that seeped into my soul, a spiritual chill that extinguished any flicker of hope, any spark of resistance. It was the cold of the void, the cold of absolute nothingness, the black limb or tentacle, or whatever it was, wrapped around my arm. Not tightly, not aggressively, but absorbingly. It was like being enveloped by cold, liquid shadow. The slick, smooth surface pressed against my skin, and the cold intensified, spreading up my arm, reaching for my core. And still the silence. No sound of contact, no rustle, no whisper, just the absolute, suffocating silence of the mist and the creature within it. Panic flared again, hotter and brighter this time, fueled by the icy touch and the crushing silence. My mind screamed, even if my throat couldn't. Run. Fight. Do something. But my body remained frozen, locked in the grip of terror. It was like my limbs had turned to lead, my muscles refusing to respond to the frantic commands of my brain. I was a statue trapped in a nightmare. Helpless as the silent horror unfolded, the black limb began to pull. Not a forceful tug, but a gentle, insistent drawing motion, like a tide pulling a pebble back into the ocean. It was pulling me towards the creature, towards the towering black shape in the mist, towards the heart of the silence. And I was going. I had no choice. My body was unresponsive, my will extinguished by the sheer alien wrongness of the thing that held me. Slowly, inexorably, I was drawn forward, sliding through the mist, my boots dragging uselessly on the gravel path. The RV receded behind me, swallowed by the white void, my last link to the normal world disappearing into the unnatural silence. I was being pulled into the unknown, into the heart of the mystery, into the maw of something ancient and terrible. As I moved closer to the creature, the shape resolved itself further, becoming less vague, more defined. The tree-like form was still there, the tall central trunk and the branching limbs. But now I could see details. The surface wasn't just smooth. It was patterned. Faint, swirling lines etched into the black obsidian, like veins in dark stone, or glyphs in some forgotten language. They pulsed faintly, subtly, with an inner light that was almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. And as they pulsed, the silence around the creature seemed to thrum, to vibrate with an unseen energy. The limbs, those writhing, tentacle-like appendages, were even more disturbing up close. They weren't just smooth. They were segmented, like the limbs of some monstrous insect or the tentacles of a colossal squid. And at the tips of some of them, I saw openings, small, circular apertures, like mouths or ears. But they weren't mouths or ears as I understood them. They were just holes. Black, empty holes that seemed to suck in the surrounding silence, amplifying it, focusing it, directing it, and then I realized what the creature was. Or at least, what it seemed to be. It wasn't a monster in the traditional sense, not a beast of claws and teeth. It was something conceptual, an embodiment of silence itself, a living void given form, animated by some unknown, unknowable force. It wasn't trying to hurt me, not in the way a predator hunts prey. It was consuming me, absorbing me, integrating me into its silent being. The thought was more terrifying than any physical threat. To be eaten by a monster is one thing, gruesome and horrible, but at least understandable. To be consumed by silence itself, to have your very essence dissolved and absorbed into the void. That was a different kind of horror, a deeper, more existential dread. It was the fear of ceasing to be, of becoming nothing, of vanishing without a trace, not just physically, but conceptually, spiritually. The creature drew me closer until I was standing directly beneath it, dwarfed by its towering form. The black, limbs writhed above me, casting long, silent shadows in the white mist. The cold was intense now, biting through my clothes, numbing my skin, freezing me from the inside out. I could feel my heart slowing, my breath growing shallower, my senses dimming, not just from fear, but from the encroaching cold, from the draining silence. One of the tentacle limbs descended, slowly, deliberately, until one of those black, empty openings was directly in front of my face. It was close enough now that I could see details I hadn't noticed before. The edges of the opening weren't smooth. They were serrated like tiny obsidian teeth. And inside the opening there was nothing, just absolute, infinite blackness. A void within a void. I stared into that black opening, mesmerized by its emptiness, drawn to its nothingness. It was like looking into the abyss, and the abyss was looking back, not with malice, not with intent, but with a cold, indifferent hunger. A hunger for silence, a hunger for absence. And I was about to become part of that absence. The opening moved closer, closer, until it was touching my face, pressing against my forehead, my nose, my lips. The cold was unbearable now, a searing, burning cold that felt like it was freezing my very thoughts. My vision started to blur, the edges of my consciousness fraying, dissolving into the encroaching silence. I closed my eyes, not in resignation, not in acceptance, but in a desperate, futile attempt to shut out the horror, to retreat into myself, to find some small refuge from the encroaching void. But there was no refuge. The silence was everywhere, inside and outside, consuming everything, leaving no space to hide, no place to escape. And then the consuming began. It wasn't a physical sensation, not exactly. There was no pain, no tearing, no crushing. It was more subtle, a draining, a leaching, a gradual fading away. It was like my senses were being turned down, one by one, fading into nothingness. First, sight. The white mist behind my eyelids dissolved into black. Then even the blackness faded, leaving just nothing. No visual input at all. Just void. Then, touch. The cold on my skin receded, replaced by numbness. Not just physical numbness, but sensory numbness, an absence of feeling, as if my skin had ceased to exist, or rather, ceased to sense. I could no longer feel the cold or the pressure of the black limb, or even the ground beneath my feet. Touch was gone, dissolved into the void. Taste and smell followed quickly, vanishing without a trace, leaving no lingering sensations, no phantom flavors, no ghostly scents. They were simply gone, erased, as if they had never been, and then hearing, or rather the lack thereof, the silence which had been deafening before, now became absolute. Not just the absence of external sound, but the absence of all sound, internal and external. The ringing in my ears faded, the phantom. Echoes of my heartbeat disappeared. The very concept of sound itself dissolved into the void. There was no silence anymore, because silence implies the potential for sound. This was beyond silence. This was unsound, a state where sound could not, and never had, existed. Finally, only one sense remained, the last flickering candle in the encroaching darkness, the sense of self, the awareness of being, the consciousness that whispered I am in the silent void. But even that was fading, dissolving, being leached away by the consuming silence. It was like my very essence was being unraveled, thread by thread, becoming thinner, weaker, less defined with each passing moment. I was losing myself. Not just my senses, not just my body, but my very identity. The memories, the thoughts, the feelings, the experiences that made me Beth. They were all fading, blurring, dissolving into the void, becoming indistinct, meaningless, non-existent. It was a slow, agonizing process, this erasure of self, this dissolution into nothingness. But it was also strangely peaceful. As the fear faded, as the panic subsided, a strange sense of calm began to settle over me. It was the calm of oblivion, the peace of non-existence, the serenity of finally, completely ceasing to be. There was no struggle anymore, no resistance, no desire to fight. Just a quiet, passive acceptance of the inevitable. I was being consumed, body and soul, by the silent mist and the creature within it, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And strangely, I no longer wanted to let go, whispered a voice in the silence. Or maybe it wasn't a voice at all. Maybe it was just the silence itself, speaking in the language of absence. Let go, surrender, become one with the void, become silence, and I almost did. I almost let go, almost surrendered completely to the encroaching nothingness, almost embraced the oblivion that was beckoning me, promising peace, promising release. From the pain of being, the burden of self, the terror of existence. But then something flickered. A tiny spark in the vast darkness, a faint whisper in the absolute silence. A memory, a fragment of a feeling, something familiar, something. Mind.it was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A tiny ember of self, refusing to be. Extinguished, refusing to be consumed. A stubborn spark of Beth, and with it a flicker of anger. Not rage, not fury, but a quiet, defiant resentment. No, I wouldn't let go. No, I wouldn't surrender. No, I wouldn't become nothing. Not yet. Not without a fight. Even if it was a futile fight, even if it was a fight I was destined to lose, I would fight. I would cling to that tiny spark of self, that ember of defiance, and I would hold on as long as I possibly could. The black limb was still touching my face, the silent void still consuming me. But something had shifted. Something had changed. The passive acceptance was gone, replaced by a nascent spark of will, a tiny flicker of resistance in the face of absolute oblivion, and in that moment, as faint and fragile as it was, that spark of will was all I had. But it was enough. It had to be enough. Because if it wasn't, then there was nothing left. Just silence. Just mist. Just the void, waiting to consume everything. The tiny spark of will, that defiant no that flickered within the encroaching void, was fragile, barely there, but it was enough to break the spell, or at least to disrupt it. The consuming silence faltered, ever so slightly, its absolute grip loosening just enough to allow a hairline fracture of something to break through. It wasn't sound, not in the conventional sense. It was more like a vibration, a faint tremor in the silence, a subtle resonance in the void. It started deep within me, a low thrumming in my chest, a faint buzzing in my brain, a vibration that resonated with that tiny spark of self, amplifying it, strengthening it, giving it voice, and with that inner vibration came a flicker of memory. Not clear images, not coherent thoughts, just fragments, echoes of sensations, whispers of emotions, glimpses of a life that was fading too quickly into the void. The warmth of sunlight on my skin, the taste of coffee on a cold morning, the sound of laughter, the feeling of love. Fleeting, ephemeral things, but precious, vital, anchors to a reality that was slipping away. These fragments of memory, these echoes of sensation, resonated with that spark of will, feeding it, strengthening it, turning it into something more substantial, something active. The defiance grew, no longer just a passive resistance, but a burgeoning force, pushing back against the consuming silence, pushing back against the encroaching void. The vibration intensified, spreading outwards from my core, resonating through my body, through the black limb that still clung to my face, through the silent mist that surrounded me. It wasn't a sound, but it was like sound, a silent echo, a vibration in the void, a resonance of self in the face of nothingness. And as the vibration grew stronger, the consuming silence began to recede. Not completely, not yet, but the oppressive pressure lessened, the suffocating weight lifted, the absolute void wavered. It was like the spark of will, amplified by memory and sensation, was creating a ripple in the fabric of the silence, a disturbance in the void, a tiny pocket of reality in the heart of unreality. The black limb recoiled, retracting. Slightly from my face, the icy cold lessening, the numbing grip loosening. The serrated opening moved away, pulling back from my forehead, my nose, my lips, breaking contact, severing the connection to the consuming void. Air rushed into my lungs. Or at least, I think it did. I could feel the expansion in my chest, the faint tremor of my diaphragm, the subtle rush of oxygen filling my starved cells. And with the breath came sound. Faint, distorted, unreal, but undeniably sound. A whisper of air moving past my lips. A ghost of a heartbeat in my ears. A phantom echo of my own breathing. Sound was returning. Not the sounds of the outside world. Not yet, but the sounds of me. The sounds of my own body, reclaiming its existence, reasserting its presence in the silent void. And with the return of sound, however faint, came the return of sensation. The cold was still there, bone-chilling and deep, but it was no longer absolute. I could feel it now, a distinct sensation, a physical reality, not just a spiritual chill. And with the feeling of cold came other sensations. Faint and flickering at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. The rough texture of the gravel beneath my boots, the dampness of the mist on my skin, the subtle pressure of my clothes against my body. Sight returned next, slowly, gradually, like dawn breaking after a long, dark night. First, just a faint glimmer of light in the blackness behind my eyelids, then a hazy, indistinct grayness, and finally, shapes began to resolve themselves in the swirling mist. Vague forms at first, blurry outlines against the white void, but becoming clearer, sharper, more defined with each breath I took. The towering black shape of the creature loomed before me, still immense, still terrifying, but no longer quite so. Absolute. The edges were less sharp, the blackness less profound, the silence less consuming. It was still there, the silent horror, but it was diminished, weakened, disrupted. The creature itself seemed to waver. The tall, black form shimmered. Like a heat haze, the edges blurring, the shape becoming less solid, less defined. The writhing limbs slowed their movements, becoming less fluid, less alive. The pulsing glyphs on its surface dimmed, the inner light fading, the silent thrumming lessening. It was retreating, not physically, not moving away from me, but conceptually. Its presence was fading, its power waning, its hold on the silence breaking. The spark of will, the echo of self, the vibration of resistance. It was working. Somehow, impossibly, it was pushing back against the void, forcing the silence to yield, compelling the creature to retreat. The black limbs retracted. Further, drawing back towards the central trunk, the serrated openings closing, disappearing into the smooth obsidian surface. The creature shrank, or seemed to shrink, the towering form becoming less imposing, less threatening. The silence around it lessened, the oppressive pressure easing, the deafening void softening. And then, for the first time since the mist had rolled in, I heard something from the outside world. Faint, distant, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. A whisper of wind rustling through unseen leaves, a faint chirp of an insect, a ghostly echo of a night bird's call. Sounds were returning to graveyard fields. The silence was breaking. The void was receding. The creature shimmered. Again, more violently this time, the black form flickering, dissolving, becoming increasingly indistinct. The pulsing glyphs faded to nothing, the surface losing its obsidian sheen, becoming duller, grayer, more mist-like. The writhing limbs contracted, drawing in towards the central trunk, becoming less like tentacles, more like branches, and then, with a final, silent shudder, the creature dissolved. Not vanished completely, not disappeared without a trace, but diffused. The tall, black form fragmented, breaking apart into wisps of dark mist, the solid shape becoming insubstantial, ethereal, fading into the surrounding white void. The writhing limbs unraveled, becoming tendrils of shadow, dissipating into the fog. The obsidian surface crumbled, turning to gray vapor, merging with the swirling mist, and finally the central trunk. It too began to fade, the tall black shape dissolving, thinning, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone. Not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with a silent, gradual fading, like a shadow retreating in the dawn light, like a nightmare dissolving with waking, and then there was nothing. Or rather, there was less. The mist was still there, thick and white, but it was no longer silent. The oppressive void was gone, replaced by a quieter silence, a more natural silence, the kind of silence you might expect in a dense fog, a silence that was still and stilling, but not. Consuming, the creature was gone, dissolved back into the mist from which it had emerged, its presence erased, its power broken, its silent reign ended, and in its wake, a fragile tentative. Peace began to settle over graveyard fields. I stood there, swaying slightly, my legs weak, my body trembling, my senses still reeling from the ordeal. But I was alive. I was whole. I was me. Beth. Still here. Still breathing. Still sounding. I looked down at my hand, still clutching the recorder. The red light was still blinking, still recording. Had it captured anything? Anything of the creature, of the silence, of the horror I had just experienced? I didn't know. And in that moment, I didn't really care. Just knowing that I had survived, that I had pushed back against the void, that I had reclaimed myself from the brink of oblivion. That was enough. Slowly, shakily, I lowered the recorder, turned, and stumbled back towards the RV. The wanderer loomed out of the mist, no longer a refuge from the void, but a beacon of normality in a world that had just tilted on its axis. The door was still open, gaping like a mouth, inviting me back into the familiar, if slightly less terrifying, confines of my metal box on wheels. I climbed back inside, collapsing onto the small couch, my body exhausted, my mind reeling. The silence inside the RV was different now, too. No longer absorbed, no longer oppressive, but normal. The faint hum of the generator was back, a low, reassuring thrum that filled the space, chasing away the last vestiges of the unnatural quiet. I sat there for a long time, huddled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, shivering despite the returning warmth, listening to the hum of the generator, listening to the faint, returning sounds of the night, listening to the echo of my own heartbeat in my ears. And slowly, gradually, the terror began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion. And then, finally, by a fragile, tentative relief. I had survived. I had faced the silent mist, the consuming void, the creature born of nothingness, and I had lived. I had made a deadly mistake, venturing out into that unnatural silence, but somehow, impossibly, I had managed to unmake it, to push back against the void, to reclaim myself, to echo in the silence, later, much later, when the first faint streaks of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. I finally dared to play back the recording. I held my breath, pressed play, and listened. And what I heard was silence. Just static, white noise, the faint hiss of the recorder itself, and then nothing. Absolute, unbroken silence. The recorder had captured it all. The silence, the void, the nothingness. But nothing of the creature, nothing of the horror, nothing of the unsound. The recording was blank. The silence had consumed even itself, leaving only an echo. The echo in my memory, the echo in my soul, the echo in this story, the echo of graveyard fields and the silent mist. And that, I knew, was more than enough, more than anyone should ever have to hear.
Story 1, my name is Jake, and if you're reading this, maybe you've heard whispers of what happened up in the Appalachians last summer. Most folks around here just call it the mountain mist incident and quickly change the subject. They say it's just a tall tale, a bit of local color to scare tourists. But I was there, I saw it, and I'm telling you, there's nothing color about the kind of dread that clings to those mountains now. It started like any other summer adventure. Me and my buddies, Mark and Chris, were itching to get out of the city. We were all pushing 30, feeling the walls of our office jobs closing in. Mark, ever the planner, suggested an RV camping trip. Appalachian Mountains, he declared, spreading out a map covered in winding roads and lush green patches. Real wilderness, guys. We can hike, fish, maybe even pan for gold like those old timers. Chris, always up for anything that involved escaping responsibility, was immediately on board. I was a little more hesitant. I'd always been a city boy, concrete and noise were my comfort zone. But the idea of wide open spaces, campfires under a sky full of stars, it did have a certain pull. Plus, Mark had this beat up but reliable RV he'd inherited from his grandpa, a real land yak from the 70s, all wood paneling and avocado green appliances. He called it the Rolling Thunder. Corny, I know, but it was free, and that was the magic word. So, we packed up the Rolling Thunder with enough beer and jerky to last a month, loaded our hiking gear, and pointed that beast south. The drive itself was beautiful. As we left the city sprawl behind, the landscape started to change. Rolling hills turned into steeper slopes, trees grew thicker, and the air got cleaner, smelling of pine and damp earth. We were heading to the heart of the Appalachians, and even I, the city skeptic, had to admit it was impressive. We found a spot in a national forest campground that Mark had booked online. It was late afternoon when we pulled in, the sun already dipping behind the towering trees. The campground was mostly empty. Just a handful of other RVs and tents scattered around. That should have been our first clue, maybe. Prime summer camping season, and this place was practically deserted. But we were too excited to notice, or maybe we just ignored it. We got the RV parked, hooked up, and started setting up camp. The air was getting cooler, the shadows longer. As dusk settled, a mist started to roll in from the valleys, clinging to the trees and blanketing the ground. It wasn't a thick fog, more like a fine, almost ethereal veil. Pretty, in a way. Atmospheric. Huh, Chris said, cracking open a beer as we sat around the picnic table, the mist swirling around our ankles. Mark nodded, staring out at the woods. Yeah, real Appalachian vibes. I just shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. It wasn't just the temperature dropping. There was something else in that mist, something unsettling. A feeling like we were being watched. Like the mountains themselves were breathing down our necks. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd driven ourselves right into the heart of something old, and maybe something we shouldn't have disturbed. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Even with the RV's windows closed, the mist seemed to seep in, a damp chill that settled in my bones. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside sounded amplified in the stillness, like something was circling the rolling thunder just out of sight. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard a whisper just outside the thin walls, a voice too low to understand, but laced with a chilling intent. Mark snored away in the bunk above me, oblivious. Chris, in the converted dinette bed, tossed and turned, muttering in his sleep. Maybe they were feeling it too, this creeping unease, but they weren't showing it. Or maybe it was just me, my city nerves on high alert in this overwhelming wilderness. When dawn finally broke, painting the mist with streaks of pale gray and weak sunlight, I felt a sliver of relief. Daylight always chases away the worst of the night terrors, right? But even in the morning light, the mist lingered, thicker in some places, swirling in slow eddies around the trees. It muted the sounds of the forest, making everything feel muffled and distant. We made coffee and breakfast, forcing down burnt bacon and instant oatmeal. The plan for the day was a hike to a waterfall Mark had found on the map, supposed to be a few miles into the woods. Fresh air, sunshine, clear our heads, Mark said, trying to sound enthusiastic, but even he seemed a little subdued. As we set off on the trail, the mist clung to us, cold and damp against our skin. The woods were eerily silent. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering. Just the soft crunch of our boots on the damp leaves and the occasional drip of moisture from the trees. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. The trail was overgrown in places, barely visible under layers of fallen leaves. The air was heavy with the smell of decaying wood and something else, something faintly metallic like old blood. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched persisted, stronger now, like unseen eyes were tracking our every move from within the mist. After hiking for what felt like hours, we still hadn't reached the waterfall. The trail seemed to twist and turn, leading us deeper and deeper into the woods. Every turn looked the same, endless trees shrouded in mist, the path always curving ahead, never quite reaching a destination. "Are you sure this is the right way, Mark?" Chris finally asked, wiping sweat from his brow even though the air was cold. "This is starting to feel like we're just walking in circles." Mark checked his phone, frowning. "GPS is still wonky. No signal out here. But the map says it should be just around here." He unfolded the paper map, but it looked different now, somehow. The lines seemed blurred, the landmarks less distinct. "This is weird." I could have sworn the waterfall was marked clearer. That's when I noticed it, a faint sound carried on the mist, a low, rhythmic humming. It was almost too quiet to hear, but once I focused on it, it was unmistakable. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a vibration in the air itself. "Do you guys hear?" they asked, stopping in my tracks. Mark and Chris listened, their faces tightening. "Yeah," Chris said, his voice hushed. "What is that?" The humming grew slightly louder, and now I could almost feel it, a subtle tremor in the ground beneath our feet. The mist around us seemed to thicken, swirling faster, and the shadows under the trees deepened, even though the sun should have been higher in the sky. Then, through the swirling mist, I saw something move. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, a shape shifting behind the trees. It was tall and indistinct, barely glimpsed through the fog, but it was definitely there. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mark and Chris nodded, their eyes wide, staring into the mist-shrouded woods. The humming intensified, and the feeling of dread that had been building all morning suddenly surged, a cold wave of pure terror washing over me. We were no longer just lost in the woods. We were being hunted. We froze. The three of us, caught like deer in headlights. The humming was almost painful now, vibrating in our chests, and the mist right around us like it was alive. Whatever moved in the shadows was getting closer. "Run," Mark hissed, finally breaking the silence. Back to the RV. We didn't need telling twice. We turned and bolted, crashing back down the trail we'd come from, branches whipping at our faces, roots tripping us up. The humming followed us, a relentless drone that seemed to burrow into our skulls. Behind us, I thought I heard a rustling, a heavy dragging sound moving through the undergrowth, keeping pace with us, too fast to be any normal animal. We burst back into the campground clearing, gasping for breath, expecting to see the reassuring bulk of the rolling thunder. But the clearing was different now. The mist was even thicker here, swirling in dense columns, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Our RV was gone. Where is it? Chris stammered, spinning around, eyes wide with panic. Mark just stared at the empty space where the rolling thunder had been parked, his face ashen. It was right here, I swear it was just right here. The other RVs and tents, the few that had been there, were gone too. The entire campground seemed to have emptied out, vanished into the mist. We were completely alone. The humming intensified again, and this time it was joined by another sound, a wet dragging scrape, closer now, definitely closer. Whatever was hunting us was no longer content to stay hidden in the shadows. "We need to get out of here," I yelled, my voice cracking. "Into the trees. Maybe we can lose it in the woods." It was a desperate plan, but staying in the open clearing felt like waiting to be caught. We plunged back into the woods, veering off the trail, pushing through thick undergrowth, hoping to put distance between us and whatever was pursuing us. But the woods seemed to shift around us, trees blurring into a disorienting maze. The mist was so thick now, it was hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. We stumbled blindly, separated by the dense fog, each of us alone in our terror. I could still hear Mark and Chris crashing through the undergrowth somewhere nearby, but their sounds were fading, swallowed by the mist and the incessant humming. I called out their names, but my voice was swallowed too, lost in the oppressive silence of the woods. Then I saw it again, the shape in the mist. Closer this time, clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall and vaguely humanoid, but distorted, stretched and elongated, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, limbs bending at wrong angles. And it seemed to glide more than walk, its feet barely disturbing the leaves on the ground. And the smell of it was overpowering now, that metallic, blood-tinged odor mixed with something else. Something rotten and sweet, like decaying fruit and burnt sugar. It made my stomach churn, bile rising in my throat. The shape drifted closer, and now I could hear another sound coming from it, a soft, wet clicking like bones grinding together, or insects clicking their mandibles. And then the whisper again, clearer this time, right in my ear, even though the shape was still some distance away. "Lost, little one." The whisper seemed to say, the voice a low, rasping murmur that vibrated in my skull. It wasn't just a sound, it was a thought, planted directly in my mind, cold and invasive. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, falling hard onto the damp ground. The shape kept coming, gliding through the mist, and now I could see details. Where a face should have been, there was just a shifting, blurred mass, like smoke swirling in a jar. Its limbs were too long, too thin, ending in hands that were more like claws, tipped with black, glistening points. And its eyes, I thought I saw eyes, two pinpricks of red light burning in the blurred mass that was its face, burning right through the mist, fixed on me with an ancient, hungry gaze. I scrambled back, crawling on my hands and knees, desperate to get away, but I knew with a chilling certainty that escape was impossible. It had found me, and the mist was closing in. "Lost, little one." The whisper echoed again, closer this time, and the ground vibrated with the humming. The shape in the mist was almost upon me, its blurred face and red pinprick eyes looming. Terror lent me a burst of adrenaline. I scrambled back to my feet, ignoring the pain in my scraped knees and hands. Running blindly was pointless. I was lost, disoriented, and it was hunting me. I needed to fight back, or at least try. Desperation clawed at me. I scanned the ground, my eyes darting wildly through the mist, searching for anything I could use. My hand closed around something cold and solid, a rock, about the size of my fist. It was pathetic, a tiny pebble against whatever that was, but it was all I had. As the shape glided closer, its wet clicking sound filling the air, I hurled the rock with all my might. It struck the blurred mass that was its face with a sickening thud. For a moment, the humming faltered, the shape recoiled slightly, and a sound like tearing cloth ripped through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A flicker of something in its red eyes, maybe surprise, maybe pain. It gave me a precious few seconds. I turned and ran again, not blindly this time, but with a desperate purpose. I had to get back to the campground clearing. maybe, just maybe, there was another way out. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes, the humming and clicking still pursuing me, but slightly further back now. The metallic stench was less intense, but the feeling of dread was still crushing, suffocating. I burst back in the clearing, expecting to see I don't know what I expected to see. More mist, more shapes. But the clearing was different again. The heavy mist had thinned slightly, revealing a scene that was even more unsettling than the woods. The campground wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with figures, dozens of them, standing motionless in the swirling mist. They were vaguely human-shaped, but distorted, elongated, like the shape that had chased me. Their faces were blurred masses, their limbs too long, too thin, and they were all facing me, their red pinprick eyes burning in the fog. They were silent, utterly silent, except for that low, pervasive humming that seemed to emanate from them all. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a silent audience of horrors watching me. In the center of the clearing, I saw it, the rolling thunder. It was back, parked exactly where we'd left it, but it looked wrong. Darker, somehow more weathered, like it had been sitting there for decades. The windows were black, reflecting nothing, and a faint, sickly sweet light glowed from inside. And standing in front of the RV, bathed in that eerie light, was Mark. Or what was left of Mark. He was taller now, thinner, his limbs stretched and distorted like the figures in the mist. His face was a blurred mass, but I could see those red pinprick eyes burning within it, fixed on me with a chilling familiarity. Jake, a voice whispered, a voice that was Mark's, but deeper, raspier, layered with that other, inhuman murmur. Join us, Jake. It's peaceful here. Chris stepped out from behind the RV, transformed too, his blurred face turning towards me, red eyes glowing. No more worries, Jake, he rasped, his voice a distorted echo of itself. No more city noise. Just quiet. They started to move towards me, slowly, inexorably, the silent figures in the mist shifting aside to let them pass. I was surrounded, trapped, with nowhere left to run. My breath hitched in my throat, a sob rising in my chest. This was it. This was the end. Then, something shifted within me. A spark of defiance. A refusal to surrender to this silent, mist-shrouded nightmare. Rage, hot and sudden, flared up in my chest, pushing back the terror, just for a moment. No, I screamed, my voice raw and desperate, echoing in the silent clearing. I won't become one of you. I don't know where the strength came from, but I turned and ran again. Not into the woods this time, but towards the road, the faint outline of the highway visible through the thinning mist. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, but I didn't stop. I had to reach the road, reach something that was real, something that was outside of this nightmare. Behind me, I heard a chorus of whispers, a rising tide of murmuring voices, and the wet clicking sound closer, closer. I didn't look back. I just ran, fueled by pure animal terror. I burst onto the highway, collapsing on the asphalt, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. The mist thinned behind me, receding back into the woods, and the humming faded slowly, agonizingly slowly, until it was just a faint vibration in the silence. I lay there for a long time, staring back at the tree line, expecting them to emerge to drag me back into the mist. But nothing came. The woods remained silent, shrouded in fog, but silent. Eventually, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, painting the sky with streaks of pale pink and gold. The mist in the woods seemed to shrink back, drawn into the shadows of the trees. And as the sun rose higher, it began to dissipate, revealing the woods again, ordinary woods, silent but no longer menacing. I was alone. Mark and Chris were gone. The rolling thunder was gone. The campground, the figures in the mist, the whispers, the humming, the shape all gone, swallowed by the silence of the mountains. I walked out of those woods, back to the highway, and eventually flagged down a passing truck driver. I told him I'd gotten lost hiking, nothing more. He didn't believe me, not really, but he gave me a ride to the nearest town. I never went back for the RV. I never went back for Mark and Chris. Some things are best left swallowed by the silence, and sometimes the call of the mountains is a call you should never answer. Now you know why I can't sleep in the dark, and why I'll never set foot in the Appalachians again, and why sometimes, when the mist rolls in, I still hear that humming, just a faint vibration in the air, and I know it's still out there, waiting. Story 2, my name is Jake, and I've always been a sucker for the open road. There's something about the endless ribbon of asphalt unspooling in front of you. The scenery blurring by that just clears my head. City life, with its constant grind and concrete canyons, always felt like it was slowly squeezing the life out of me. So, whenever I could, I'd pack up my old RV. Bessie, yeah, I know, real original name, and just drive. No destination in mind, just a direction and a yearning for green. This time the yearning was stronger than usual. Work had been a pressure cooker lately, deadlines piling up like dirty dishes, and my apartment felt smaller and stuffier with each passing day. My buddy Mark, bless his impulsive heart, suggested the Appalachians. Dude, think about it, he'd said, eyes wide with that adventurous glint he gets. Mountains, forests, fresh air. We could park Bessie somewhere deep in the woods. Hike all day, cook over a campfire at night. Total digital detox. Mark is the kind of friend who's always up for anything, the kind who drags you out of your comfort zone, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. He's also the kind who believes every spooky story he reads online, which, frankly, is most of them. He'd been rambling on about some forum he found, filled with whispers of strange happenings in the Appalachian wilderness, unexplained phenomena, and areas best left untouched. Normally I'd roll my eyes, but this time, a tiny seed of intrigue, or maybe just exhaustion, took root. Appalachians, huh? I'd mumbled, staring out my cramped apartment window at the brick wall opposite.
Yeah, man. Think about it.
We could hit up Shenandoah, maybe even push further south into the Smokies. Imagine the views, the hiking, and... He leaned in conspiratorially, lower in his voice. Maybe even a little adventure. He winked, and I knew exactly what kind of venture he meant. Ghost stories and campfire tales brought to life. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe it was the promise of escape, maybe it was Mark's infectious enthusiasm, or maybe, just maybe, a tiny part of me was curious about those whispered legends. Whatever it was, a week later, I found myself behind the wheel of Bessie, Mark's shotgun, and the Appalachian Mountains looming on the horizon. The drive started out idyllic enough. Rolling hills gave way to steeper inclines, the air grew crisper, and the endless green canopy closed in overhead. We blasted classic rock, windows down, the smell of pine and damp earth filling the RV. Mark, predictably, was glued to his phone, scrolling through those forums, reading out snippets of local lore. Listen to this one, Jake. Hikers vanish without a trace of mists that move on their own strange lights in the valleys. He paused for dramatic effect. Dude, this place is practically begging for a ghost story. I chuckled, trying to keep it light. Mark, for every spooky story, there are 1,000 perfectly normal explanations. Probably just bears and fog, maybe some overactive imaginations. He just grinned, unconvinced. Maybe. But what if we drove deeper into the mountains, following winding roads that seemed to shrink with every mile? Cell service vanished hours ago, and the GPS was starting to act flaky, the little blue dot on the screen jumping around erratically. Even Bessie, usually a reliable old beast, seemed to be struggling a bit, the engine groaning on the steeper climbs. As afternoon bled into evening, the forest grew denser, the shadows longer. A heavy stillness settled over the landscape, the cheerful birdsong of earlier replaced by an unnerving silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick, heavy with a dampness that clung to your skin, and a faint, almost metallic scent started to permeate the air, something I couldn't quite place. Getting a little quiet, isn't it? Mark said, finally putting his phone down, his usual bravado replaced with a hint of unease. He was looking out the window, his eyes scanning the deepening shadows between the trees. Yeah, I admitted, a prickle of something not entirely pleasant running down my spine. Just the deep woods, Mark. Peace and quiet, remember. That's what we wanted. But even as I said it, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. It wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. Like something was listening, something was waiting. The trees themselves seemed to lean in, their branches like gnarled fingers pointing the way deeper into the wilderness. And the air, that strange metallic scent, it was getting stronger, almost coppery. I glanced at Mark. He was staring out the window again, his face pale in the fading light. He didn't say anything, but I could feel it too. Something was definitely off. This wasn't just peace and quiet. This was something else entirely. and I had a sinking feeling we were about to find out exactly what. The road narrowed further, devolving into little more than a rutted track barely wider than Bessie herself. Branches scraped against the RV's sides, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the dying light. The metallic smell was now unmistakable, like blood and old pennies, thick enough to taste in the back of my throat. Mark was silent, his usual chatter replaced by a nervous fidgeting, cracking his knuckles over and over again. Maybe we should find a place to stop for the night, I suggested, my voice sounding a little too loud in the oppressive quiet. It's getting dark, and this road is something else. Mark nodded quickly, relief flickering across his face. Yeah, good idea. Pull over when you see somewhere open. Open was the key word. The trees were closing in, the forest pressing against us like a living thing. I wanted to see the sky again, to feel a little less like we were being swallowed whole. Just as I was starting to think we'd be driving blind through the trees all night, the track opened into a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a flattened patch of earth ringed by towering pines, but it was enough. Enough to pull Bessie off the track, enough to see a sliver of the bruised twilight sky above. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and steered the RV into the clearing, the tires crunching on loose gravel. Thank God. Mark breathed, finally unclenching his hands. I was starting to feel like we were driving into the earth itself. We killed the engine, and the silence that descended was almost deafening. No birds, no crickets, just nothing. The air hung heavy and still, the metallic scent even stronger here, clinging to the damp earth and the pine needles underfoot. Campfire time, I asked, trying to sound more upbeat than I felt. Distract us from the ambience. Mark managed a weak smile. Yeah, fire sounds good. We said about the familiar routine of setting up camp. A practice dance we'd done dozens of times before. But tonight the easy camaraderie felt forced, strained by the oppressive atmosphere of the clearing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made us jump. The shadows seemed to writhe and deepen, playing tricks on the edges of our vision. As I wrestled with the stubborn propane tank for the camp stove, I caught Mark staring into the tree line, his brow furrowed. What is it? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He blinked, startled. Huh? Oh, nothing. Just, did you hear that? Hear what? The silence. He shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the woods. No, before. Like a whisper. Faint, but someone calling my name. I listened, straining my ears. Nothing but the rustling of the wind in the pines, a sound that seemed to amplify the silence rather than break it. Wind's playing tricks, Mark. Let's just get this fire going. But even as I dismissed it, a cold tendril of unease snaked its way around my heart. I hadn't heard anything, but Mark wasn't usually one to imagine things. Especially not whispers. We managed to coax a fire to life, the flames struggling to catch on the damp wood, spitting and hissing as they fought against the moisture. The flickering light pushed back the encroaching darkness, creating a small bubble of warmth and relative safety in the clearing. We sat huddled close to the flames, mugs of lukewarm coffee in hand, the fire crackling and popping in the unnatural stillness. So, I said, trying to break the tension, forum guy said anything about whispers. Mark jumped, nearly spilling his coffee. Dude, don't do that. He glared at me, then his eyes flickered back to the woods. Actually, yeah. Sort of. There was something about voices in the mist. Said they lure people deeper into the woods, never to be seen again. I snorted, despite myself. Come on, Mark. Voices in the mist. Sounds like a bad B movie. He didn't laugh. He just kept staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, his face pale and drawn. Maybe. Or maybe those forums are onto something. The fire crackled again, throwing sparks up into the still night air. The metallic scent seemed to intensify, swirling around us like the smoke from the struggling flames. And in the silence, a new sound emerged. Faint at first, almost imperceptible. A low, rhythmic thumping like a heartbeat resonating deep within the earth. Did you hear that? Mark whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire I had. That slow, steady thumps at the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something primal. Something that resonated deep in my bones, stirring a fear I couldn't name. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist into grotesque shapes. The trees around the clearing seemed to lean closer, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out. And the thumping, it was getting louder, closer. Thump, thump, thump. Mark and I exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between us. Whatever was happening in this clearing, in these woods, it wasn't natural, and we were right in the middle of it. The campfire, once a comforting beacon, now felt like a fragile defense against something ancient and hungry lurking just beyond the edge of the light. And the night, I suddenly realized, was still young. Very young. The thumping grew louder, resonating in my chest, a slow, deliberate pulse that seemed to sync with my own racing heart. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the woods, from the deep, impenetrable darkness beyond the firelight, and it was getting closer. Mark scrambled back, bumping against Bessie's side, his eyes wide with terror. What is that? What the hell is that sound? I shook my head, my throat suddenly dry. I don't know, but I don't like it. My hand instinctively went to the knife I always kept sheathed on my belt, the cold steel a small comfort against the rising tide of fear. The fire popped and hissed, sending a shower of sparks in the air, momentarily illuminating the trees around us. And in that fleeting burst of light, I saw them. Figures, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the flames, their forms indistinct in the flickering shadows, but undeniably there. Watch it. They were tall, impossibly so, their shapes elongated and distorted, like stretched shadows given form. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but their presence was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on the clearing, and the thumping, it was coming from them, from within them. Mark, I whispered, my voice trembling despite myself, look at the trees. He followed my gaze, his breath hitching in his throat. Jesus, what are they? The figures remained motionless, their silence more terrifying than any scream. The firelight danced in their non-existent eyes, reflecting back as faint points of red, like embers glowing in the dark. And the thumping, it was deafening now, vibrating through the ground, shaking the very air around us. Thump, thump, thump. Suddenly one of the figures moved. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped out of the shadows into the firelight. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Impossibly thin and elongated, its limbs too long, its head a featureless oval perched atop a neck that seemed to stretch on forever. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a puppet with tangled strings. And then it spoke. Not with a voice, not with sound as we understood it, but with something else. Something that resonated directly in my mind, a cold, alien thought that bypassed my ears entirely. Lost. The word echoed in my skull, a single, chilling syllable that conveyed a sense of ancient sorrow, of endless wandering, and with it came a wave of bone, deep dread, a primal fear that threatened to paralyze me. The figure took another step forward and another, its jerky movements bringing it closer to the fire, closer to us. The thumping intensified, and the metallic scent in the air grew overwhelming, making my stomach churn. We need to go, I hissed, grabbing Mark's arm, pulling him towards Bessie. No. Get in the RV, lock the doors. Mark didn't argue. He was pale as death, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure, but he moved, scrambling towards the RV door, fumbling with the handle. I kept my eyes on the figure, backing away slowly, the knife held out in front of me. A pathetic defense against something I didn't understand, something that felt ancient and malevolent. The figure stopped at the edge of the firelight, its featureless head tilting slightly, as if studying us. The red embers in its eye sockets seemed to burn brighter, and the thought echoed in my mind again, stronger this time, laced with a chilling hunger. Ours. Mark finally wrestled the RV door open and scrambled inside. I followed, slamming the door shut behind me, fumbling with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the metal. I dove into the driver's seat, fumbling for the keys, my eyes glued to the figures outside. They were moving now, slowly converging on the clearing, their elongated shapes gliding through the trees, the thumping growing into a deafening roar. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands slick with sweat, turning it with desperate force. The engine sputtered, coved and died. Dead silence, except for the thumping. Thump, thump, thump. No, 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 I muttered, turning the key again and again, pumping the jazz pedal, willing Bessie to life. Nothing. The engine remained stubbornly silent, mocking my desperation. Panic clawed at my throat, choking me. I looked out the window. The figures were closer now, surrounding the RV, their elongated forms pressing in, blocking out the last vestiges of twilight. The firelight flickered across their featureless faces, illuminating those burning red eyes. Ours. The thought echoed again, closer now, more insistent, laced with an undeniable threat. Mark was whimpering beside me, huddled in the passenger seat, his face buried in his hands. I grabbed his shoulder, shaking him roughly. "Mark, we have to get out of here. We have to run." He looked up, his eyes wide and unfocused, tears streaming down his face. "Run." Where? There's nowhere to run. He was right. We were trapped, surrounded. The figures were closing in, their thumping presence clearing my mind, filling my very soul with a cold, paralyzing dread. Ours. I grabbed the knife, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. It was a useless gesture, I knew, but it was all I had left. I opened the RV door, the metallic scent flooding inside, thick and suffocating. I stepped out into the clearing, the firelight flickering across my face, the figures looming before me. "Leave us alone," I yelled, my voice cracking. A pathetic defiance against the ancient horror that surrounded us. "Just leave us alone." The figures didn't react, didn't move. They just stood there watching, waiting, the thumping of relentless pulse in the oppressive silence. And then, slowly, deliberately, they began to raise their elongated arms, their impossibly long fingers pointing towards us. Towards Bessie, towards the heart of the woods. Come home. The thought echoed, not just in my mind, but in the very air around us, a cold, irresistible invitation, laced with the promise of something ancient and terrible. Come home to stay. The figures began to advance, their jerky, unnatural gait bringing them closer, the thumping growing to a deafening crescendo. Thump, thump, the firelight flickered and died, plunging the clearing into absolute darkness. And in that darkness, I knew we were no longer lost. We were found, and we were theirs. Stowai 3, my name's Dale, and I've always been drawn to the Appalachian trails. There's something about the ancient mountains, the way the trees claw at the sky, and the stories whispered on the wind that just calls to me. This year, I finally convinced my buddy Mike to ditch the usual beach vacation and join me for an RV camping trip deep in the heart of them. Black Balsam Knob was our first stop. I'd seen pictures online 360-degree views that stretched forever, they said. We were chasing the last bit of fall color, hoping to catch the mountains ablaze before winter truly set in. We rolled into the parking area late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the peaks, and then we saw it, the fog. Not just any fog, mind you. This was thick, almost solid, like a living thing rolling over the mountainsides. It wasn't raining, but the air was heavy with moisture, and the world started to mute as the white blanket crept closer. Beautiful and eerie at the same time, that's the only way to describe it. Mike, always the practical one, was already grumbling about visibility for the hike, but I was hooked. This fog, it felt different, like it held secrets or maybe warnings. We found a spot to park the RV, the fog now swirling around us like curious ghosts. As we were unloading, a park ranger, a wary older guy with eyes that seemed to have seen too much, approached us. Evening, he drawled, his voice raspy like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Camping up here." We nodded, and I flashed him my most enthusiastic grin. Black Balsam Knob. Heard the views are incredible. The ranger just stared at the fog, his gaze distant. Views are something, all right, when you can see 'em. He paused, then turned his attention to us, his eyes suddenly sharp. "Fog's rolling in heavy tonight. Be careful up there." "Fog's never bothered us," Mike said, always quick to dismiss any hint of danger. "We're experienced campers." The ranger's lips thinned. "This ain't just any fog, son. This fog, it carries whispers." He leaned in, lowering his voice, though there was no one else around. "Whispers that can lead you astray. Folks get lost up here in the fog, wander right off the trails. Don't listen to the whispers." He gave us a hard look, then turned and walked back towards his truck, disappearing quickly into the thickening mist. Mike scoffed as the ranger left. "Whispers. What is this? A fairy tale." But I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. "Maybe he just means it's easy to get disoriented in the fog," I said, trying to sound reasonable, even though a part of me felt like the ranger meant something more, something unsettling. Still, the lure of Black Balsam Knob, shrouded in this mysterious fog, was too strong to resist. We decided to hike up anyway. Deadly mistake number one looking back. The trailhead was just past the parking lot, swallowed almost immediately by the fog. It was like stepping into a different world. The familiar sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, were muffled, muted by the oppressive white. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, 30 at best. Mike pulled out his phone, checking the trail map app. Says it's a pretty straightforward path to the summit, he announced, sounding more confident than I felt. We started walking, the crunch of our boots on the gravel trail the only sound besides our own breathing. The fog pressed in on us, cold and damp against my skin. It wasn't long before I started to feel uneasy. It was more than just the isolation, the limited visibility. There was a stillness in the air, a sense of being watched, even though we were completely alone. Then I heard it, faint at first, almost like the wind sighing through the trees. A whisper. I stopped, cocking my head. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mike. He kept walking, not even pausing. Hear what? Just the wind, man. But it wasn't the wind. It was softer, more melodic, and closer than the wind. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the fog itself. I strained my ears, trying to make out words, but it was just a murmur, a sibilant sound that tickled the edge of my hearing. "No, listen," I insisted, stopping Mike in his tracks. "There's something whispering." He finally stopped and listened, his brow furrowed. For a moment, there was only silence, the heavy, muffled silence of the fog. Then, just as I was about to doubt myself, I heard it again, a breathy, indistinct sound, like someone speaking just beyond the veil of mist. Mike's eyes widened slightly. "Okay," he admitted, his voice a little quieter now. "Yeah, I hear it. Weird." He shrugged it off quickly, though. "Probably just the wind playing tricks in these rocks. Come on, let's keep moving. Don't want to get stuck up here in the dark." We kept walking, but the whispers grew stronger, clearer. They seemed to be just at the edge of my hearing, murmuring things I couldn't quite grasp, yet somehow understood. They weren't words, not really, but feelings, suggestions. Go this way further, deeper. It was like the fog itself was trying to coax us, to lure us off the trail. "Did you hear what it's saying?" I asked Mike, my voice barely above a whisper now. He shook his head, his face pale in the gray light. "No, but I feel it. Like something wants us to go over there." He gestured vaguely into the swirling mist to our left, away from the marked path. "The ranger," I breathed, the warning echoing in my mind. He said not to listen to the whispers. But the whispers were insistent now, pulling at us. A siren song in the fog. Just a little further, the view's better, you're almost there. And the thing was, I did want to go. The fog was beautiful, mesmerizing. And the whispers promised something wonderful, just beyond the veil. Against my better judgment, against the ranger's warning screaming in my head, I started to veer off the trail, drawn by the whispers, Mike following close behind, equally captivated. The trees grew closer, the undergrowth thicker. The marked path disappeared behind us, swallowed by the fog. And as the trail vanished, the whispers changed. They were no longer gentle lures. They became hungry. "Closer, yes, come closer," were waiting. A cold dread washed over me, chilling me to the bone deeper than the fog ever could. This wasn't beautiful anymore. This was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. "Mike," I choked out, grabbing his arm, grabbing me to go back. "Now." He blinked, snapping out of the trance, his eyes widening in terror. Yeah, you're right." We turned to retrace our steps, but the trail was gone. Just fog and trees in every direction. We were lost. Truly, utterly lost. And then we heard it, not whispers anymore, but a rustling in the fog, something moving, something big, and it was coming closer. The whispers turned into a chorus, a triumphant, gleeful sound. "We have you know, you listened, you came." The rustling grew louder, branches snapping, the ground crunching under heavy weight. We couldn't see it, not in the fog, but we could feel it, sense it, something unseen, something ancient hunting us in the white abyss. We ran. Blindly, desperately, crashing through the undergrowth, the whispers chasing us, mocking us, the unseen thing gaining ground. I don't know how long we ran or where we ran to. All I remember is the fog, the whispers, the rustling, and the bone-deep terror. We never made it to the 360-degree views of Black Balsam Knob. We made a deadly mistake listening to the whispers in the fog. If you ever find yourself camping in the Appalachians and the fog rolls in, remember the ranger's warning. Don't listen to the whispers. Because if you do, you might find yourself lost, hunted, and swallowed whole by something ancient and unseen in the white abyss.